Miss Marple, and the mystery at the morning market. Hello, dear friends, and welcome back to Warm Chapters. I'm Thomas, and it truly is a joy to have you here as the day gently comes to a close. Get comfortable now, and let yourself listen. Chapter 1. When the first vendors arrive at dawn. The first Saturday of June came to St Mary Mead with that deceptive innocence which belongs only to early summer in the English countryside. It was the sort of morning on which nothing wicked ought properly to happen. The light lay softly over the village green, pale gold at first, then warming by slow degrees as the sun lifted above the roofs and chimneys. Dew still silvered the grass verges. The old elm at the eastern edge of the green cast a long shadow over the path, and from the bakery lane there drifted the comfortable smell of warm bread, yeast, and newly browned crust. Somewhere beyond the churchyard wall a thrush was singing with the untroubled conviction of a creature to whom human affairs were of no consequence whatever. By 7 o'clock, however, the village green had ceased to be merely picturesque. It had become purposeful. The Saturday market had begun. In St Mary Mead, the weekly market was not an event so much as an institution. It possessed, like all true village institutions, an outward simplicity and an inward complexity. To a stranger, it might have appeared no more than a crescent of stalls arranged about the green, a pleasant scattering of produce, flowers, baked goods, butter, eggs, herbs, and the occasional piece of needlework. To those who lived in the village, however, every stall had its proper place, every customer had his or her customary hour, and every small deviation from habit was capable of comment. The produce stalls stood to the left. The baked goods and preserves occupied the centre, where trade was always briskest. At the far end, near the elm, one found cut flowers, lavender, bunches of rosemary, and those miscellaneous offerings which were too useful to be decorative, and too decorative to be dismissed as merely useful. The arrangement had existed for so long that no one could quite remember who had first decided it. It was maintained now not by rule, but by something stronger. Village expectation. Miss Jane Marple arrived at 7:45. She came as she always did, walking at a measured pace, a wicker basket over one arm, her gloves already buttoned, and her hat set with an old-fashioned correctness upon her white hair. She wore grey-blue, as she often did, and looked, to the casual observer, exactly what she appeared to be, a neat, elderly gentlewoman doing her Saturday shopping. But appearances, Miss Marple had learned over a long life, were among the least reliable things in the world. She passed slowly between the stalls, pausing now and again. Sometimes she looked at the goods displayed, sometimes she looked at the hands arranging them, and sometimes, though no one would have supposed it, she looked at the spaces between things, the misplaced jar, the delayed greeting, the hand withdrawn too quickly, the voice made deliberately cheerful. Villages were very like embroidery, Miss Marple often thought. From a distance one saw a charming pattern. Close up one noticed the knots. She bought a small pot of honey from a young woman she did not know, though she made a mental note to ask later whose niece or cousin the girl might be. She exchanged a word with old Mr. Appledore about the state of his sweet peas. She admired, without purchasing, a bunch of pinks, and then moved toward the centre of the market where the most established stalls stood in their familiar places. Mrs. Clara Dunning's stall was, as always, a pleasure to behold. It was not grand. Nothing in St Mary Mead Market could honestly be called grand. But it possessed a quiet perfection. Rows of preserve jars stood with their labels facing outward, each label written by hand in Mrs. Dunning's round, careful script. Strawberry, damson, gooseberry, quince jelly. The baked goods were arranged upon cream linen cloths, plain scones, shortbread fingers, little sponge cakes iced in pale yellow and white. There was no ornament for ornament's sake, no ribbon where none was needed, no flourish intended to attract attention. Everything was clean, exact, and proper. It was, in fact, very like Mrs. Dunning herself. Clara Dunning was a woman of about 60, sturdily built, with a pleasant weathered face and grey-brown, hair which had a tendency to escape from its pins as the morning advanced. She had been widowed 12 years before, and had responded to widowhood in the fashion of certain capable women, not by diminishing, but by becoming more completely herself. She was liked in St. Mary Mead. That was not the same thing as saying she was merely tolerated, or that she had escaped dislike by being inoffensive. Mrs. Dunning had earned her place in village affection by small, repeated acts of reliability. She remembered who preferred damson to strawberry. She put aside shortbread for old Mrs. Harmon when Mrs. Harmon's rheumatism prevented her from arriving early. She never pressed gossip, though she heard a good deal of it. She had the rare gift of kindness, without curiosity becoming intrusion. "Good morning, Miss Marple," she said warmly, as Miss Marple paused before the stall. "I have some shortbread this morning that I think is a little better than usual." "Indeed?" "A little extra butter," said Mrs. Dunning with modest satisfaction. "Not enough to be extravagant, but enough to make a difference." "One finds," said Miss Marple, "that the small differences are often the important ones." Mrs. Dunning laughed, not because the remark was especially amusing, but because Miss Marple had a way of saying ordinary things as though they were quietly significant. She pressed upon her a small paper bag containing 2 shortbread fingers. "You must tell me if I've improved them." "I shall be very happy to," said Miss Marple. She moved on. The next stall belonged to Mrs. Beatrice Melling, a widow of a somewhat different temperament. Mrs. Melling was tall, well-dressed, and composed in a manner that suggested she had long ago decided precisely how much warmth was socially necessary, and had resolved never to exceed it. She sold eggs, very fine eggs, as she was careful to point out, and butter of local provenance. Her stall was neat, but not affectionate, efficient rather than loved. She gave Miss Marple a civil nod. "Good morning, Miss Marple." "Good morning, Mrs. Melling, a fine day." "Yes," said Mrs. Melling, "though it may become too warm later." There was nothing unfriendly in the words, yet Miss Marple observed, as she had observed before, that Mrs. Melling spoke as though every pleasant thing must be balanced by a caution. A little further along, George Hollis presided over his fruit stall with the expansive confidence of a man who believed himself popular and was, for the most part, correct. He was large, red-faced, and middle-aged, with a laugh that travelled ahead of him and remained behind after he had gone. He sold apples, plums, strawberries in season, and whatever else the local farms had produced in sufficient quantity. He had a hearty manner, a quick joke, and the useful gift of making customers feel that they were receiving special treatment even when everyone received precisely the same. Yet Miss Marple had noticed more than once a small hardness beneath the geniality. It showed itself when prices were discussed. It appeared when someone spoke of fairness. It sharpened his voice when he thought he had been overlooked. There are people, Miss Marple knew, who forgive injuries readily, and others who preserve them in the mind like dried flowers pressed between the pages of a book. George Hollis, she suspected, belonged to the second category. "Morning, Miss Marple," he called. "Best strawberries in 3 parishes. I'd stake my reputation on it." "Then I hope they are very good indeed," said Miss Marple. He laughed loudly, perhaps a shade too loudly. Near the far end of the stall stood Miss Violet Trent. Miss Trent was not a stall-holder. She was, rather, a customer of principle. A small, neat woman in her middle 40s, with dark hair, a narrow face, and a precise manner, she attended the market every Saturday not merely to purchase goods, but to uphold standards. She carried a small notebook in which she recorded prices, quantities, and, it was generally believed, moral deficiencies. No one disliked Miss Trent exactly. Dislike would have required more warmth than she inspired. But people found themselves standing a little straighter when she approached. She returned Miss Marple's greeting with a careful nod and made a note. And then there was Arthur Pike. Arthur was perhaps 28, a delivery man from a firm in the neighbouring town. His route brought him near St. Mary Mead on Saturdays, and he had fallen into the habit of stopping at the market, where there was always conversation, the possibility of tea from the Women's Institute table, and sometimes an apple or plum pressed upon him by George Hollis. He was cheerful, uncomplicated, and eager to be useful. He lifted boxes, fetched string, carried parcels, and blushed when thanked. Such young men are generally called harmless, though Miss Marple had always felt that harmlessness was a quality more often assumed than proved. That morning Arthur moved between the stalls with his usual good humour, pausing longest at George Hollis's fruit stall. George gave him a plum, clapped him on the shoulder, and said something that made Arthur laugh. Miss Marple saw all this. She saw Mrs. Dunning's steady hands arranging the last of the sponge cakes. She saw Mrs. Melling glance twice toward the centre stall and once toward Miss Trent's notebook. She saw George Hollis lean over his strawberries with a proprietary air. She saw Arthur Pike put down a crate near the refreshment table, then pick it up again when one of the Women's Institute ladies looked at it with disapproval, all quite ordinary. And yet ordinary things, Miss Marple knew, were the very things most worth observing. Wickedness, when it came, seldom announced itself with thunder. More often it entered by the side gate, wearing a familiar hat. By 10:30, the market was at its liveliest. Children had been sent on errands and had forgotten half of them. The vicar's wife was comparing gooseberry prices with an air of deep spiritual concern. Old Mr. Appledore had sold nearly all his sweet peas and was telling anyone who would listen that the soil was not what it had been 30 years ago. At Mrs. Dunning's stall, trade remained brisk. Miss Marple noticed that the strawberry preserve had sold particularly well, as had the shortbread. Mrs. Dunning moved with her usual efficient calm, rapping, counting, smiling, making change, setting aside items with the little deliberate gestures of a woman whose mind and hands had long ago reached an understanding. Shortly before 11, the morning began to draw toward its close. It did so gradually, as market mornings always did. Customers drifted away with baskets fuller than they had intended. Stallholders began to glance at remaining stock. Cloths were straightened, boxes were brought forward. There came that faint relaxation which follows a good morning's trade when the work is not yet done, but the anxiety of it has passed. Then something altered. There was no cry, no crash, no exclamation loud enough to turn every head at once. The change was quieter than that, a slowing, a hesitation, a little pocket of stillness forming at the centre of the market and widening outward, as circles widen when a stone has been dropped into water. Miss Violet Trent was the first to notice. She had returned to Mrs. Dunning's stall to make a second purchase, not because she had forgotten something, Miss Marple thought later, but because she wished to compare the price of shortbread fingers with the price she had recorded the previous week. Finding no one at the front of the stall, Miss Trent frowned. Mrs. Dunning did not leave her stall unattended. Miss Trent stepped around the side. Then she stopped. The expression that crossed her face was not dramatic. Miss Trent was not a dramatic woman. But something in her posture changed so completely that those nearby turned to look. Mrs. Clara Dunning was seated on the small wooden chair she kept behind the stall. She used that chair only when trade was slow, and then only briefly. Now she sat quite still, her hands folded in her lap, her head inclined a little forward, as though she had paused in the midst of a thought, and had not returned from wherever that thought had taken her. Her face was calm, almost peaceful. Within moments people had gathered, though not too near. Villagers have a deep instinct for the proper distance at which to stand from misfortune. George Hollis removed his cap. Arthur Pike set down the empty crate he had been carrying and stared. Mrs. Melling came forward with composed gravity. Her mouth tightened, her hands folded neatly before her. Someone went for the police. Someone else suggested the doctor. A Women's Institute lady began to cry quietly and was led away by another, who looked as though she rather wished to cry too, but had decided it would be more useful not to. Miss Marple did not join the cluster. She remained several yards away, her basket on her arm, and looked not at Mrs. Dunning, but at the stall. The jars were still arranged in their careful rows. The cream linen cloths were still smooth. The labels faced outward. The remaining cakes sat precisely where they ought to sit, and one basket stood slightly apart from the rest. Miss Marple looked at it for a long moment. It was a plain wicker basket covered with a folded cloth. There was nothing in itself remarkable about it, yet it stood at an angle that displeased the eye. Not greatly, not enough for most people to remark upon, but enough. It had not been placed there with Mrs. Dunning's hand. Inspector Slack arrived presently, as Inspector Slack always did when St. Mary Mead required official attention. He came with a constable, a notebook, and the air of a man prepared to be sensible in the face of unnecessary complication. There was murmuring, statements, questions, the solemn phrases appropriate to sudden death. Miss Marple heard them distantly. Her attention remained on the stall. The morning was still beautiful. The sun still shone upon the green. The smell of bread and flowers still lingered in the air. The old elm still moved faintly in the light breeze, and yet the whole market had changed. Not because death had come. Death came, sooner or later, everywhere. It had changed because in the midst of order there was one thing out of place. Miss Marple stood very still and thought about habits. People revealed themselves by their habits, by the way they folded a cloth, tied a parcel, greeted a neighbour, avoided a glance, returned a jar to its row. And when a person of fixed habit departed from that habit, even in some tiny respect, it was never wise to say merely, "It does not matter." Very often, Miss Marple had found, it mattered most of all. Chapter 2. A wicker basket left to one side. Inspector Slack disliked uncertainty. He did not dislike crime precisely. Crime, when properly labelled and sensibly arranged, had its place in the professional life of a policeman. Burglary, assault, forgery, drunkenness, domestic quarrels. These were inconvenient but comprehensible. They possessed motives, methods, suspects, and with luck, witnesses who could be made to give their statements in a straightforward fashion. Uncertainty was different. Uncertainty had a way of making villagers talk, and when villagers talked, they did not confine themselves to facts. Inspector Slack had arrived at the market within 20 minutes of being summoned. His notebook was open before he had quite reached Mrs. Dunning's stall, and his expression suggested a man who intended to be thorough, provided thoroughness did not require the entertainment of foolish ideas. He questioned those nearest the stall. He took down names. He recorded times. He listened in his own fashion, which was to say that he heard everything which seemed useful, and became faintly irritated by everything which did not. Then he closed his notebook halfway, which in Inspector Slack's case was often the prelude to a conclusion. "Sudden illness," he said, "happens more often than people suppose. A woman of her age, on her feet since early morning, warm weather, busy market, not surprising." The words were meant to calm. They had the opposite effect upon Miss Violet Trent. She stood at a precise distance from the stall, her notebook clasped in both hands, her lips pressed together. The phrase "not surprising" appeared to offend her deeply. Mrs. Dunning, she said, was not in the habit of sitting down before her stall was tidied. Inspector Slack turned toward her. "People's habits," he said, "are not always as fixed as those who observe them suppose." Miss Trent looked at him steadily. "No," she said. "Sometimes they are more fixed." It was not an argumentative tone. Miss Trent did not argue. She corrected. Inspector Slack's pencil moved sharply across the page. Miss Marple, who had been standing a little apart, now came nearer. She didn't offer an opinion. She did not even appear to be listening with any particular eagerness. She merely looked at the stall. It remained, even in the aftermath of distress, an orderly object. The jars of preserves still stood in rows. Strawberry damson, gooseberry quince. The handwritten labels faced forward. The baked goods that remained had not been jumbled or neglected. 2 small cakes sat upon their paper doilies. A few shortbread fingers lay arranged at a slight diagonal, exactly as Mrs. Dunning always arranged them, because as she had once told Miss Marple, they look less severe that way. The cloths were smooth, the money box was closed, the twine was coiled, the wrapping paper was weighted by a small blue stone. All this was Mrs. Dunning. The basket was not. It sat at the left edge of the stall, drawn back perhaps a foot from where another basket stood. It had been moved, not placed. That was the distinction which interested Miss Marple. A placed object belongs to its surroundings. A moved object interrupts them. She reached out and lifted the cloth folded over the top. Inspector Slack, who had just turned to speak to his constable, noticed too late. Inside the basket lay a jar of strawberry preserve, its wax seal intact, 3 shortbread fingers wrapped in greaseproof paper, and a small bunch of dried lavender tied with pale ribbon. Miss Marple replaced the cloth carefully. "I shouldn't touch anything, Miss Marple," said Inspector Slack with controlled patience. "If you don't mind." "Of course not," said Miss Marple pleasantly, and withdrew her hand. Inspector Slack regarded the basket with the expression of a man determined not to see anything in it, merely because someone else had looked first. "Unsold goods," he said. "Yes," said Miss Marple, "there would naturally be unsold goods." "Oh, naturally." Her agreement appeared to annoy him. George Hollis had drifted closer. Large men attempting to seem unobtrusive often achieve the opposite, and George's effort to remain respectfully in the background made him appear more conspicuous than ever. "Kept things very tidy, did Clara," he said, clearing his throat. "Always did. Place for everything and everything in its place, as they say." His voice, usually hearty, had softened. "She was a good sort," he added. "A very good sort." "Had you known her long?" asked Inspector Slack. "All my life, near enough. Same as most of us." "And did you notice anything unusual this morning?" George's eyes moved toward the basket and away again. "Unusual? No. Busy morning. Good trade. Weather brought people out. You spoke with Mrs. Dunning?" "A word or two. Nothing particular." "Nothing particular," repeated Inspector Slack, writing it down. Miss Marple looked at George Hollis's hands. They were large, capable hands, stained faintly with fruit. One thumb worried at the edge of his cap. Arthur Pike stood at the edge of the group, looking unhappy in the manner of a young man who feels he ought to help but has not been given a task. "She was always kind," he said suddenly. Inspector Slack looked up. "Yes?" "Mrs. Dunning, she always had a kind word. I used to stop by most Saturdays." "For what purpose?" Arthur flushed. "No purpose. Just passing. My route brings me near. Sometimes I'd have tea. Sometimes George would give me a plum." George Hollis gave a short laugh, but it fell flat. "No harm in a plum." "No one suggested there was," said Inspector Slack. Arthur looked more miserable than before. Miss Marple's gaze moved from Arthur to George, and then to Mrs. Melling. Mrs. Beatrice Melling had remained by her own stall for most of the proceedings. She had continued with admirable composure to serve such customers as still approached her, though trade had understandably diminished. She weighed eggs, wrapped butter, accepted coins, and gave change with the restrained efficiency of a woman who had decided that steadiness was the most respectable response to tragedy. When Inspector Slack went to her, she received him with quiet attention. "You arrived at your usual time?" "Yes." "And that was?" "A little before 7. "You spoke to Mrs. Dunning?" "At approximately 9 o'clock." "Approximately?" "I do not consult my watch before every conversation, Inspector, but the church clock had struck 9 not long before." "What was said?" "Nothing of consequence. The weather, the number of customers. She remarked that the shortbread had sold well." "Did she seem unwell?" "No." "Distressed?" "No." "Anxious?" Mrs. Melling paused, but only for a fraction of a second. "Not that I observed." Miss Marple observed the pause. Inspector Slack did not, or appeared not to. "Did you see anyone approach her stall shortly before she was found?" "People approached her stall all morning. It was a market." Inspector Slack's pencil stopped. "I mean anyone unusual." "Unusual in St. Mary Mead," said Mrs. Melling, "is a word requiring careful definition." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. Inspector Slack did not smile. Miss Violet Trent had been waiting. She now stepped forward with the air of someone who has allowed sufficient time for lesser observations and is prepared to provide the important one. "I should like to make a statement," she said. Inspector Slack sighed without quite sighing. "Very well, Miss Trent. Mrs. Dunning was most particular. I use the word deliberately. She was particular about her jars, her cloths, her accounts, her change, and the condition in which she left her stall. I have attended this market for 11 years. I have never once seen her leave goods in that fashion." "In what fashion?" Miss Trent turned her head toward the basket. That basket was not arranged by Mrs. Dunning. Inspector Slack glanced at it. "How can you possibly know that?" "Because it is untidy. It is a basket containing unsold goods." "It is a basket containing selected goods," said Miss Trent. "That is quite different." The words caused Miss Marple to look at her more attentively. Inspector Slack frowned. "Selected? A jar of strawberry preserve, 3 shortbread fingers, lavender. Those are not random leavings. They form a parcel, or would have done, had they been arranged properly." There was a short silence. George Hollis looked at the basket again. Arthur Pike swallowed. Mrs. Melling from her own stall had become very still. Inspector Slack wrote something down. "Mrs. Dunning may have been preparing it for someone," he said. "Yes," said Miss Trent, and then felt unwell before completing it. "That is possible." Miss Trent said the word possible as though it were a poor relation she had reluctantly admitted into the house. "But," said Inspector Slack, "but Mrs. Dunning would not have put lavender with shortbread unless the lavender was wrapped separately. The scent carries." Miss Marple gave the smallest of nods. It was an excellent point. Inspector Slack looked annoyed, as policemen sometimes do when domestic knowledge becomes inconveniently relevant. "I see," he said, but he did not see. Not yet. Miss Marple accepted a cup of tea from the Women's Institute table and held it between both hands. It was rather too strong but not unpleasant. She stood where she could see the stall, the basket, and the faces of the people, who believed themselves to be watching one another discreetly. A jar of strawberry preserve, 3 shortbread fingers, a bunch of lavender, a basket set aside but not properly. It might be nothing. Miss Marple was always careful to allow for that. Human beings made mistakes. They grew tired. They became distracted. They forgot themselves. A woman might, in the last moments before sudden illness, set down a basket carelessly. But Clara Dunning had not been a careless woman, and if the basket had been meant for someone, then the question was not merely why it had been left unfinished. The question was, for whom? Miss Marple sipped her tea and considered the morning. Mrs. Dunning had been alive at 9, cheerful enough to remark on the shortbread. She had traded through the busiest part of the morning. Shortly before 11, she had been found seated behind her stall. No disturbance, no cry, no sign of alarm. The stall remained orderly except for the basket. The basket contained not leftovers exactly, but a small selection, a thoughtful selection, a gift perhaps, or an order. Strawberry preserve because it had sold well. Shortbread, newly improved with extra butter. Lavender, tied with ribbon. A domestic combination, a kindly one. And yet there was something wrong in it. Miss Marple had known many women like Clara Dunning, women who had suffered, endured, arranged, preserved, remembered. Such women might be generous, but they were not haphazard. If Mrs. Dunning had prepared a basket for someone, she would have wrapped the lavender apart. She would have placed the jar at the bottom. She would have tied the greaseproof paper properly. She would have set the whole thing to one side with intention. This basket had been interrupted, or imitated. The thought was unpleasant. Inspector Slack was speaking again. "I shall need each of you to remain available. There will be a medical examination, of course. Until then, there is no need for speculation." This naturally produced immediate speculation. People murmured in low voices. They repeated what had already been said. They improved upon what had already been said. Someone recalled that Mrs. Dunning had looked pale the previous week. Someone else denied it. A third person said June heat was dangerous. A fourth observed that it was not especially hot. Miss Marple listened. Village gossip, though often inaccurate in detail, was rarely useless in essence. It revealed what people wished to be true, what they feared might be true, and what they were anxious not to mention. She noticed that George Hollis had become subdued, that Arthur Pike looked repeatedly toward the lane, as though tempted to leave and ashamed of the temptation, that Miss Trent had written several lines in her notebook and then underlined one of them, that Miss Trent had resumed serving customers, but had not once looked again at the basket. Not once. That interested Miss Marple. The constable passed carrying a folded sheet of paper. He nodded politely to Miss Marple, entirely unaware that she had reached, in her quiet fashion, the beginning of an inquiry. She finished her tea and set down the cup. The sound it made against the saucer was small but decisive. "People who are particular," she murmured so softly that no one but the nearest Women's Institute lady could have heard, "do not abandon their arrangements without reason." The lady who thought Miss Marple was speaking about the tea-table said, "No, indeed, though with all this upset I'm sure anyone might forget the sugar tongs." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "anyone might." But she was not thinking about sugar tongs. She was thinking about the basket, about strawberry preserve and lavender, about selected things made to look like leftover things, and about the dangerous ease with which one person may try to borrow another person's habits without quite understanding the small private rules by which those habits are governed. The market outwardly had begun to return to itself. Customers drifted away. Stallholders spoke in lowered voices. The sun rose higher over the green. Yet to Miss Marple the whole arrangement had altered. It was like looking at a familiar room after someone had moved one chair by an inch. Most people would never notice, but one could no longer pass through it in the dark without striking one's knee. She picked up her wicker basket and turned, very slowly, to look once more at the people gathered on the green. Somewhere among them, she thought, there was someone who had made a mistake. Not a large one, not yet. But murder, if murder it was, often began to unravel from the smallest thread. Chapter 3. Miss Marple spots. Something out of the ordinary. Sunday in St. Mary Mead possessed a stillness of its own. It was not the stillness of emptiness, nor of neglect. The village was never truly silent. There was always the faint click of a gate latch, the scrape of a hoe against soil, the distant bark of a dog who considered it his duty to remark upon every passer-by. But on Sundays these sounds seemed softened, as though the village had wrapped itself in a shawl, and agreed, by ancient custom, to move more slowly. The church bells marked the morning in their familiar intervals. Their notes floated over tiled roofs, cottage gardens, the green, the vicarage lawn, and the narrow lanes where cow parsley still lingered in the hedges. Those who attended church did so with the air of people performing a duty that was not disagreeable. Those who did not attend church found reasons to be in their gardens, where they could be both industrious and invisible. Miss Jane Marple spent the early part of the morning among her sweet peas. There were certain matters requiring attention. A tie had loosened. A stem had bent the wrong way. A small invasion of greenfly had declared itself upon one of the more promising plants, and Miss Marple dealt with it firmly but without resentment. Greenfly, unlike human beings, were seldom hypocritical. They did what their nature prompted them to do, and one knew where one stood with them. Afterward she sat beneath the apple tree in the wooden garden chair she kept there for fine mornings, her knitting in her lap and her eyes apparently fixed upon a border of lavender and pinks. Anyone passing the garden might have thought her mind occupied with wool, weather, and the likelihood of rain before Tuesday. In reality, Miss Marple was thinking about Mrs. Clara Dunning, not merely about her death. Death, after all, however sad, was not in itself mysterious. People died suddenly. They died on summer mornings, during market hours, in armchairs, on pavements, in church pews, and once, Miss Marple remembered with particular vividness, in the middle of judging the best marrow at a village show. The human body was a fragile arrangement, though most people preferred not to dwell upon that fact until compelled. No, what interested Miss Marple was not that Mrs. Dunning had died. It was the manner in which the morning around her had altered before she died. Miss Marple had known Clara Dunning for 11 years, not intimately. They had not been close friends in the village sense, which involved confidences over tea and the borrowing of preserving pans, but they had possessed the comfortable familiarity created by repeated small meetings over time. Miss Marple had bought strawberry preserve from her. She had exchanged remarks with her at the post office, at the church fete, and at the autumn sale. She had observed her, as Miss Marple observed almost everyone, with quiet and unadvertised exactness. Clara Dunning had been above all a woman of order, not the brittle order of a person frightened by disorder, but the settled order of one who has discovered how she likes the world arranged, and has taken reasonable steps to see that her portion of it remains so. There was a difference, and Miss Marple considered it important. Mrs. Dunning arranged her stall from left to right. She placed her preserves in rows according to kind, never according to colour, though the latter would have made a prettier display. She counted her change at regular intervals. She wrapped shortbread with 2 folds and a tuck. She tied parcels firmly, but never with a knot so tight that an elderly customer would struggle to undo it. None of these things were affectations, they were habits. And habits, Miss Marple reflected, were among the most revealing possessions human beings had. One might lie with words, one might even lie with tears. But habits were less obedient. They came from deeper places. She set down her knitting. The basket had been on the left. That returned to her again, as it had returned several times since Saturday morning. Mrs. Dunning would not have put it there, not if she had been herself. The thought was simple, almost absurdly simple. Yet the more Miss Marple considered it, the less willing she became to dismiss it. A person of no particular habits may put a basket anywhere. A tired woman may set something down carelessly. But Clara Dunning, at the close of a market morning, would have set unsold goods in the large flat basket at the back of the stall, slightly to the right, within reach of her hand but out of the way of customers. She had done so for years. Miss Marple had seen it. Miss Trent had seen it. George Hollis, whether consciously or not, had surely seen it too. And yet the basket had been forward and left, set aside perhaps, or moved. Miss Marple rose, went indoors, and telephoned Mrs. Dolly Bantry. Dolly Bantry arrived at 3 o'clock that afternoon with the promptness of a woman who had been given just enough information to be interested and not enough to be satisfied. She came into Miss Marple's sitting room in a brisk rustle of skirt and curiosity, and settled herself in the armchair opposite the tea table, as though preparing to hear not merely news, but news with layers. "I hear it was quite a morning at the market," she said, before Miss Marple had finished arranging the cups. "Mrs. Price told me, and then I met young Constable Davies near the gate, and he said it was all very sad but nothing to be alarmed about, which of course always makes one feel immediately that there may be a great deal to be alarmed about." Miss Marple poured the tea. "Inspector Slack has formed a view." Dolly looked at her over the rim of her cup. "Has he? That sounds ominous. What view?" "He thinks Mrs. Dunning was taken suddenly unwell." "Well," said Dolly fairly, "I suppose people are." "Yes, it is not an unreasonable conclusion on the surface. Mrs. Dunning was about 60. She had been on her feet since early morning. The day was warm." "But," said Dolly. Miss Marple added milk to her tea. "But," she agreed, "she had a way of doing things." Dolly leaned back. She knew that tone. Over many years of friendship she had learned that when Miss Marple began with something as apparently harmless as a woman's way of doing things, one was very often being led toward murder by a garden path. "Clara Dunning," said Miss Marple, "was a woman of very regular habits. She arranged her stall in the same way every Saturday. Not approximately the same way, the same way. Her preserves were set out from left to right. Her wrapping paper was weighted by the blue stone. Her change was kept in the left section of the money box, takings in the right, and when the morning was drawing to a close, she put unsold items in a flat basket at the back of the stall on the right. Dolly considered this, and on Saturday, the basket was forward and to the left. That could mean she was tired. It could. Or distracted. Yes, said Miss Marple, that is nearer. There was a pause. Outside, a blackbird gave a clear liquid note from somewhere near the lilac bush. The sound came into the sitting room through the half-open window, sweet and indifferent. Dolly watched Miss Marple's hands. They were steady as they lifted the teapot, but there was an inward alertness about her friend which Dolly had seen before. It always gave her a curious feeling, part admiration, part apprehension. You said the basket was not the only thing. No. Miss Marple set down the teapot. George Hollis said something on Saturday, quite casually. He said Clara had seemed a little distracted earlier in the morning. That sounds ordinary enough. It was the word that interested me. Not tired, not pale, not unwell. Distracted. Dolly frowned thoughtfully. George is not a subtle man. No, which makes the word more useful perhaps. He would not have chosen it for effect. He was describing what he had seen. And what had he seen? A woman whose attention was not where it usually was. Dolly sat silent. Miss Marple continued. A tired woman slows down. She drops things, perhaps. She sits when she would normally stand. But a distracted woman continues to act, only without the full attention that usually governs her actions. She misplaces something, counts wrongly, repeats a movement, looks at a familiar object as though it has become unfamiliar. Dolly's face changed. Counts wrongly. There were coins in Mrs. Dunning's money box which did not belong to the ordinary pattern of her takings. What sort of coins? Florins. Florins? Several of them, together. Dolly stared. I don't see why that matters. No, said Miss Marple gently. Most people would not. She didn't say this dismissively. There were many things she knew which mattered only because they sat beside other things. One odd coin was nothing. A basket in the wrong place was nothing. A woman frowning over money was nothing. A death on a warm morning could be nothing more than a death on a warm morning. But put them together, and they began to make a shape. Mrs. Dunning sold preserves and small baked goods, Miss Marple said. Her prices were modest and regular. People came prepared with the appropriate coins. She was not a woman to encourage complicated change. It delayed trade, and she disliked confusion at the stall. Then the florins were unusual. Yes. Could they have come from someone buying a great many things? Possibly. But Miss Trent, who notices these matters, seemed to think not. And I find Miss Trent's noticing, though occasionally trying in ordinary social life, quite valuable in the present circumstances. Dolly gave a short laugh. She does notice. I once saw her look at a sponge cake as though it had committed fraud. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Just so. She lifted her cup, then set it down again without drinking. Dolly recognised that gesture. Miss Marple had arrived at the part of the matter that truly troubled her. Clara Dunning was distracted. Her stall, which was normally the expression of her character, showed small signs of disturbance. Her coins were not what one would expect. A basket had been placed where she would not have placed it, and she was found before the market had properly ended, seated behind her stall, without having tidied it in the way she'd done for 11 years to my own certain knowledge, and likely for far longer. When you put it like that, Dolly said quietly, it does not sound much like sudden illness. No, but sudden illness might explain some of it. Some, said Miss Marple, not all. Dolly turned her cup in its saucer. Could she have had bad news, something that upset her? That is possible. In fact, it is one of the possibilities that interests me most. Why? Because distraction is often caused by something unexpected, not always something frightening, sometimes merely something that does not fit. A word spoken by the wrong person, a request made at the wrong time, Money offered for something that was not for sale. Dolly looked up sharply. You think someone came to her stall and spoke to her? I think, said Miss Marple, that something happened before she was found, something which disturbed her regular pattern, and whatever it was, it had enough weight to cause a composed woman to become careless in small ways. Outside, the blackbird sang again. The afternoon light had deepened into the warmer gold of early June, and the room, with its chintz-polished wood and small table of tea things, seemed too gentle a setting for the thoughts passing between the two women. But Miss Marple had never found gentleness incompatible with truth. Indeed, it was often in gentle rooms that the most terrible truths were first spoken aloud. "What will you do?" asked Dolly. Miss Marple picked up her knitting again. "I shall think about it carefully, and I shall go to the market next Saturday as I always do." "Next Saturday?" "Yes, but Mrs. Dunning's stall will not be there." "No," said Miss Marple, "and that too will be informative." Dolly looked puzzled. Miss Marple drew a length of pale blue wool through her fingers. People speak differently in the presence of absence. They remember more freely. They correct themselves. They become sentimental or defensive or over-careful. And memory, you know, is a very revealing thing. Because of what it retains, yes, and because of what it chooses to leave out. Dolly sat back considering this. She had known Jane Marple too long to dismiss anything she said, yet there were moments, even now, when she found herself startled by the quiet severity of her friend's mind. Miss Marple was kind, no one could deny it. She was gentle in manner and old-fashioned in dress. But beneath that softness lay a knowledge of human beings which was not soft at all. "I suppose," Dolly said slowly, "that people do tell the truth accidentally." "Very often," said Miss Marple, "and sometimes they lie accidentally too. That can be even more useful." The two friends sat in companionable silence for a while. The clock ticked. The tea cooled. The garden settled in the late afternoon light. And somewhere within Miss Marple's mind the market began to arrange itself again. Mrs. Dunning at her stall, George Hollis with his fruit and his hearty voice, Miss Trent with her notebook, Mrs. Melling with her composed face, Arthur Pike moving between stalls, and one person, still without name, without form, standing close to Clara Dunning at the side of the stall where ordinary customers did not stand. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. A basket on the left, coins that did not match, a woman distracted. It was not proof, but it was pattern, and Miss Marple had long ago learned that when human beings wished to hide something, they generally attended to the large things and forgot the small ones. The small ones, in consequence, were where one ought to begin. Chapter 4. The Wrong Amount of Change. Monday brought St. Mary Mead back to itself, not completely. Death leaves a residue, particularly in a village, where news does not merely spread but settles, on doorsteps, in shop conversations, across garden walls, in the lowered voice of a woman buying tea, in the pause before a man mentions the weather. Still, Monday was Monday. The shops opened at their accustomed hours. The postman made his rounds with his usual unhurried reliability. Mrs. Price was seen beating a rug with rather more energy than the rug appeared to deserve. The butcher discussed cuts of lamb, as though no mystery had ever approached his counter, and at the post office 2 elderly ladies agreed 3 times that it was very sad, which in St. Mary Mead was often the first stage of serious inquiry. Mrs. Clara Dunning's death remained present, but decorously so. It was handled in the English manner, with lowered voices, practical sympathy, and a heightened attention to the proper making of tea. Miss Marple walked into the village at 9 o'clock. She had no particular object in view, or so she would have said if asked. In point of fact, Miss Marple very often had no particular object in view, in precisely the way a cat has no particular object in view when sitting outside a mouse-hole. She bought a quantity of thread at the haberdasher's. She exchanged a few words with Mrs. Appledore about the school fete arrangements. She paused to admire a row of delphiniums, and then, by a route so natural that it would have been impossible to describe it as deliberate, she came to the gate of the small terrace where Miss Violet Trent kept house. Miss Trent was in her front garden. This did not surprise Miss Marple. Miss Trent was exactly the sort of woman who would be in her front garden at 9:30 on a Monday morning, not because she enjoyed gardening in any loose or sentimental sense, but because plants, like people, had a tendency toward disorder if not corrected early. She was deadheading roses with systematic precision. The removed blooms lay in a shallow basket, arranged by colour, though Miss Marple was inclined to think this was not intentional decoration, but an inevitable expression of Miss Trent's character. At the sound of the gate, Miss Trent looked up. "Miss Marple," she said, "I had thought someone might call. That was interesting, not 'How nice to see you,' not 'What a pleasant surprise,' but I had thought someone might call." Miss Marple smiled. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "No, I've nearly finished." Miss Trent snipped one last dead rose with the air of a woman concluding an argument, set the scissors down on the garden ledge, and led Miss Marple inside. Her sitting room was precisely what Miss Marple had expected. Every object had been considered. Not necessarily loved, but considered. The chairs stood at correct angles. The mantel ornaments were arranged symmetrically. The books on the shelf were ordered by height, which Miss Marple always thought rather a severe way to treat books. Near the window stood a small desk, and upon it lay a leather-bound notebook, larger than the one Miss Trent carried to the market. Beside it rested a clipped stack of papers, the clip aligned perfectly with the corner. Miss Trent invited Miss Marple to sit. "You're here about Saturday," she said. "I am interested," said Miss Marple, "in what you observed." Miss Trent folded her hands. "Regarding Mrs. Dunning generally, or regarding the money?" Miss Marple's eyes rested on her for a moment. "The money, I think, to begin with." Miss Trent nodded once, as if this confirmed private expectation. "I keep records," she said, "of my own purchases and of prices generally. I've done so for several years. It is useful to know whether costs are rising, whether quantities are altered without notice, and whether inconsistencies appear from one week to the next." "Very sensible," said Miss Marple. She meant it. Miss Trent's habits might be socially exhausting, but they were not without value. "I purchased from Mrs. Dunning's stall at approximately 9 o'clock on Saturday morning," Miss Trent continued. "A jar of quince jelly and 2 shortbread fingers. The prices were exactly as they had been on the previous 3 Saturdays. She took my money, counted it, and gave me change from the left-hand section of her box." The left-hand section? Change. She always kept change on the left and takings on the right. Always? Always. There are people, Miss Marple thought, who use always carelessly. Miss Trent was not one of them. "She was quite as usual then?" Miss Marple asked. "Yes, entirely. Calm, pleasant, exact." "And later?" Miss Trent's mouth tightened. "At about 10 o'clock I passed a stall on my way toward the far end of the green. I did not make another purchase. I had already bought what I required. But I noticed Mrs. Dunning counting coins. That was unusual. No, she counted her takings periodically throughout the morning, more or less at the same intervals. What was unusual was the manner of it." Miss Marple waited. "She was counting them twice." "Twice? The same coins?" "She counted them once, then again," and she frowned. Miss Trent leaned forward slightly. "I know the frown of a person who has miscounted. It is a practical frown. Irritated, perhaps, but not disturbed. This was not that. This was the frown of someone looking at something she did not expect to find." Miss Marple sat very still. Confirmation, when it comes, should never be seized too quickly. It must be allowed to take its proper place. "You did not speak to her?" "No." Miss Trent's voice altered almost imperceptibly. "I did not wish to interrupt. She seemed occupied. I assumed she would sort it out." The last sentence remained in the room after she had spoken it. "I assumed." Few phrases contained more quiet regret. "One always assumes there will be time," Miss Trent said. It was a simple observation, and because it was simple, Miss Marple received it silently. For all her sharpness, Violet Trent had not been unkind. She had merely been herself, precise, observant, unwilling to intrude. And now, like many people after a death, she was discovering that restraint can become a form of reproach when viewed backward. After a moment, Miss Marple said, "The coins found in Mrs. Dunning's takings were unusual." Miss Trent's expression sharpened. Inspector Slack did not appear to understand that. "Inspector Slack has many excellent qualities," said Miss Marple mildly. Miss Trent gave a short, dry exhalation. There were 3 florins in the right-hand section of the box. "Together?" "Yes." "You're certain?" "I saw them when the box was examined. 3 florins among the takings, not change, takings." Miss Marple considered this. Mrs. Dunning's prices would not naturally produce such a payment. No, her goods were modestly priced and known to her regular customers. A jar of preserve, a few shortbread fingers, a small cake. These didn't result in 3 florins appearing together. People came with shillings, sixpences, smaller coins. Mrs. Dunning disliked complicated transactions. She said they slowed the morning and confused the line. "Could someone have bought a larger quantity?" Miss Trent shook her head. "Not from what remained, and not from what I observed. In any case, Mrs. Dunning would have wrapped a larger order. She would have made a note of it if it were to be collected later. She did not conduct business vaguely." "No," said Miss Marple, "and she did not." Miss Trent looked toward the desk where her own records lay. 3 florins together mean one of 2 things. Either someone paid her 6 shillings for something priced at 6 shillings, which she did not sell in the ordinary course of business, or the coins were given to her for a reason not reflected in her usual trade. "Or placed there," said Miss Marple. Miss Trent looked at her. "Yes, or placed there." The room was very quiet. Outside, a cart passed along the lane, its wheels making a faint grinding sound against the road. Somewhere nearby a child laughed and was immediately hushed by an adult, though whether because of Mrs. Dunning's death or some unrelated offence could not be known. Miss Marple thanked Miss Trent. She did so sincerely. There are people whose virtues become tiresome under ordinary conditions and invaluable under extraordinary ones. Miss Trent's exactness, usually the despair of stall-holders and shopkeepers, had preserved a detail that might otherwise have vanished entirely beneath Inspector Slack's sensible conclusion of sudden illness. As she left, Miss Trent accompanied her to the gate. "I should have spoken to her," Miss Trent said abruptly. Miss Marple turned. "Perhaps, or perhaps it would have made no difference." Miss Trent looked unconvinced. Miss Marple added gently, "We must be careful not to suppose that every moment before a tragedy was an invitation we failed to answer. That way lies a great deal of unnecessary misery." Miss Trent's face softened, though only slightly. "Still," she said. "Yes," said Miss Marple. "Still." She walked back through the village shortly before 11. By then St. Mary Mead had reached that hour of the morning when purposeful errands begin to give way to conversations disguised as errands. Mrs. Price stood outside the post office talking to Mrs. Harmon. The butcher's boy cycled past too quickly and was told so by 3 people in succession. Near the corner by the lane, Miss Marple encountered Arthur Pike. He was coming the other way with an empty delivery satchel over one shoulder and the slightly unsettled expression of a young man who had finished his work but not his thoughts. When he saw Miss Marple, he looked almost relieved. "Miss Marple, I was very sorry about Saturday. About Mrs. Dunning, I mean." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "she was much liked." "She was, always pleasant." "Did you know her well?" Arthur shook his head. "Not really, only from the market. I'd stop there most Saturdays, if my route brought me through at the right time. She sometimes set aside a small cake for me if there was one left near the end." He smiled, and for a moment looked younger. "She always said I looked as if I needed feeding up." "That sounds like Mrs. Dunning." "She was kind," said Arthur. There was an awkwardness in him that interested Miss Marple. Not guilt, necessarily. Guilt had many faces, but so did discomfort. Arthur seemed more like the discomfort of a person who has remembered something and is not sure whether remembering it late makes him somehow blameworthy. "Were you near her stall on Saturday morning?" Miss Marple asked. Arthur shifted the satchel strap on his shoulder. A few times, just passing mostly. At what time? I couldn't say exactly. Around 9:30 perhaps, or nearer 10. I had been over by George's stall, then I went toward the van, then back again. And did you notice anything? He frowned. I didn't think I had. That is, not at the time. But now? Arthur looked down the lane, then back at Miss Marple. I thought I saw someone speaking to her. To Mrs. Dunning? Yes, at the side of the stall. Miss Marple's expression did not change. Not at the front? No, that's what seems odd now. Customers stood at the front. This person was at the side, close in. Almost as if they'd come from behind the stall rather than across the green. Did you recognise them? No. Was it a man or a woman? Arthur's frown deepened. It was the frown of effort, not evasion. I don't know. I'm sorry. They were wearing a coat, I think. Not a heavy one, just a coat. They were on the shorter side, but I can't see the face. It's like when you remember a thing only by the space it occupied. That was well put, Miss Marple thought, though Arthur appeared embarrassed by having said it. Did Mrs. Dunning seem distressed? I didn't see clearly enough then, but later, perhaps 20 minutes after, I passed again. The person had gone, and Mrs. Dunning was at the front of her stall. She looked. He stopped. Yes, Arthur struggled. She looked like someone who had just been told something and was still deciding whether to believe it. Miss Marple held that sentence carefully in her mind. That is very helpful, Mr. Pike. Is it? I should have told Inspector Slack, shouldn't I? It would be worth mentioning, Arthur flushed. I didn't think of it properly until afterward. I mean, everyone was upset and Inspector Slack was asking questions, and it seemed foolish to say I'd seen someone when I couldn't even say who it was. Many useful observations seem foolish at first, said Miss Marple. Arthur nodded slowly. I'll tell him. Yes, said Miss Marple, pleasantly but firmly. I think you should. He went on his way with the expression of someone who had been given a duty and was grateful for it. Miss Marple continued toward home. She walked slowly, not because she was tired, but because walking slowly suited thought. The village lane curved past a low wall bright with aubracia, then narrowed near the churchyard where the yews stood dark and still. Beyond them the green lay quiet in the late morning sun. Saturday's market had vanished, of course. The stalls were gone. The chatter was gone. Mrs. Dunning's neat rows of preserves existed now only in memory, but Miss Marple could see them very clearly. She could see the money box, left section and right section. She could see Mrs. Dunning counting coins once, then again. She could see the frown Miss Trent had described, not annoyance but surprise. She could see a person standing close at the side of the stall where customers did, not stand. She could see Arthur Pike passing, seeing and not understanding. She could see afterward Mrs. Dunning returning to the front of the stall, her body present, her mind elsewhere. And she could see the basket, forward and left. A small domestic object in the wrong place. 3 florins. Money, Miss Marple reflected, had a peculiar honesty. People might lie about why they gave it, or why they received it, but the money itself remained stubbornly factual. It told one that an exchange had occurred. The difficulty lay in discovering what sort of exchange it had been. Payment, refund, bribe, debt, blackmail. The last word came into her mind uninvited and remained there. She did not like it, but she did not dismiss it. In villages, money was seldom only money. It carried history with it. Obligations, resentments, favours, old injuries, family pride, shame. A coin passed from one hand to another could be the end of a transaction, or the beginning of a threat. When she reached her gate, Miss Marple paused and looked back toward the village. A person at the side of the stall. 3 florins that had not been earned in the ordinary way. A woman of fixed habit made suddenly inattentive, and then death. No, Miss Marple thought, it would not do to call this nothing. She went inside, removed her gloves and put the kettle on. While the water heated, she stood at the kitchen window and looked out at her garden without seeing it. The kettle began to sing. Miss Marple did not move at once. She was thinking about 3 florins, and about the kind of person who, wishing to hide an extraordinary act, would try to bury it in the most ordinary place imaginable: a market stall, a money box, a basket of preserves and lavender on a golden Saturday morning in June. Chapter 5. A cloth square, scented with lavender. Tuesday came to St. Mary Mead under a sky of pale grey cloud. It was not a threatening sky. There was no drama in it, no heavy darkness gathering behind the elms, no rumble of thunder beyond the church tower. It merely softened the village, dimming the brightness of the previous days and lending the lanes, gardens and cottage fronts an air of subdued reflection. Even the roses in Miss Marple's garden appeared a little quieter, their colours less brilliant but perhaps more deeply themselves. Miss Marple cut several before breakfast. She did so with the calm satisfaction of one performing a small task correctly. The roses were at their most abundant, and she chose them carefully. Not the showiest blooms, but the ones that would last best in water. A little later, they stood in a blue glass vase upon the sitting-room table, where their scent mingled faintly with lavender polish, old paper, and the remaining warmth of the morning fire. By mid-morning, Miss Marple had settled herself near the window with her correspondence and the modest remains of a pot of tea. She had written one letter to a cousin in Cheltenham, and had begun another when the garden gate clicked. It was a small sound, but Miss Marple knew the voices of her gate almost as well as she knew the voices of her neighbours. This click was followed by footsteps of a definite and official kind. She was not in the least surprised when she opened the door to find Inspector Slack upon the step. He removed his hat. "Good morning, Miss Marple." "Good morning, Inspector. Do come in." Inspector Slack came in with the air of a man who had not called to consult, but who nevertheless had called. He looked about the sitting-room as though checking, in some obscure official sense, that it had not changed since his previous visits. Then he declined tea in the absent manner of a person who has not decided whether declining it is more efficient than accepting it. Miss Marple did not press him. He sat in the upright chair near the door rather than the more comfortable armchair by the hearth. It was a choice which said a good deal about his state of mind. A man who sits near the door wishes to remain master of his departure. He opened his notebook. "I have had the results of the medical examination," he said. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. "Yes." "Digitalis." The word lay between them, small and cold. Inspector Slack glanced at her. "A sufficient quantity to account for what occurred. The question of how it was administered remains less immediately clear." "I see," said Miss Marple, and she did see. Digitalis was not an accidental sort of word. It did not wander innocently into a market morning. It did not belong among strawberry preserves, shortbread fingers, bunches of lavender, eggs, butter, and cheerful remarks about the weather. It belonged to medicine cupboards, prescriptions, careful measurements, old remedies, dangerous knowledge, and, in the wrong hands, intent. "Mrs. Dunning had no known heart condition," Inspector Slack continued. "No reason to be taking anything of the kind medically. The quantity was not consistent with accidental ingestion." "No," said Miss Marple quietly. "It would not be." Inspector Slack gave her a look. He was never entirely certain, in conversation with Miss Marple, whether he was explaining matters to her, or being led to explain matters to himself. The uncertainty did not please him. "I shall be speaking again to the stallholders and others who were present. Naturally, I am pursuing the matter with all necessary attention. Naturally. In the meantime, I should be grateful if you would avoid." He paused. "Interfering?" suggested Miss Marple helpfully. "I was going to say, drawing conclusions." "Of course," said Miss Marple, with a pleasantness that committed her to nothing at all. Inspector Slack shut his notebook. "I thought you should know." "That was very kind of you." He looked as though he strongly suspected it had not been kindness, but could not quite decide what else it had been. After he'd gone, Miss Marple remained seated for some time without returning to her correspondence. Digitalis. She had expected something of this sort, not digitalis specifically perhaps, but something deliberate, something introduced quietly, something that could move through a warm market morning under the cover of ordinary human exchange. She looked toward the roses on the table. Poison, in Miss Marple's experience, had a deceptive domesticity about it. People imagined violence as something loud, impulsive and dramatic. But poison could be quite otherwise. It could be measured in drops, stirred into something harmless, carried in a bottle no larger than a scent vial, administered under the smiling conventions of neighbourliness. A little taste of this, a sip of that. Try one, my dear. No one at a market remarked upon such things. People accepted samples, cups of tea, wrapped parcels, borrowed jars, folded notes, small kindnesses, and small obligations. The very ordinariness of a market made it dangerous. Things passed from hand to hand all morning, and no one thought to remember them. Miss Marple considered Arthur Pike's account, a figure at the side of the stall, not at the front where customers stood, at the side, close in, almost as if the person had approached from behind. A brief conversation, Mrs. Dunning afterward looking like someone who had been told something and was still deciding whether to believe it, and the florins. 3 florins among the takings. Money was one form of exchange, but perhaps not the only one. Something else might have passed that morning, something small enough to be unnoticed, something intimate enough to be accepted. After a while, Miss Marple took up her correspondence and finished both letters in her neat, steady hand. Then she put on her coat and walked into the village. It was at the post office that she encountered Mrs. Beatrice Melling. This was not surprising. Mrs. Melling was known to come to the post office on Tuesdays to collect a money order from a relative in the north. In a village, such knowledge is not considered spying. It is simply part of the invisible map by which everyone knows where everyone else may be found at particular hours. Mrs. Melling stood at the counter conducting her business with composed precision. She wore a dark coat, well brushed, and gloves of excellent quality. Her hat was plain but becoming. Nothing about her invited comment. Everything about her discouraged familiarity. She turned as Miss Marple entered and inclined her head. "Good morning, Miss Marple." "Good morning, Mrs. Melling." A rather thoughtful sort of day. Yes, though it may clear later. This, Miss Marple thought, was entirely characteristic. Mrs. Melling allowed the weather neither too much gloom nor too much hope. They exchanged a few words about Saturday. Mrs. Melling said, quite properly, that Mrs. Dunning's death was a great shock. Miss Marple said that it must have been distressing for those at nearby stalls. Mrs. Melling agreed that it had been distressing. Her words were correct. Her tone was measured. Then Mrs. Melling gathered her things and the 2 women left the post office together. For a few yards they walked side by side along the grey morning lane. It was one of those encounters which, in any larger place, might have seemed arranged. In St. Mary Mead it was merely what happened when people had lived among one another, long enough for coincidence to become habitual. "I find myself thinking often about the market," Miss Marple said, in the reflective tone of one making conversation rather than conducting an inquiry. "One comes to know people through regular contact, does one not? Not intimately, perhaps, but in a way that is sometimes quite revealing." "Mrs. Dunning was a consistent woman," said Mrs. Melling. "One always knew what to expect from her." "Yes, that is very true." Miss Marple let 2 steps pass. "Did you speak with her much? I know your stalls were not immediately adjacent, but the market people form a small community of their own." "We exchanged the usual courtesies. We were on perfectly friendly terms, but I would not say we were intimate." The phrase was exact. It had the polished surface of something said before. Miss Marple looked ahead at the lane. "I noticed," she said mildly, "that you use lavender starch for your linens." Mrs. Melling glanced at her. It was a quick glance, not alarmed, not guilty, but attentive. "Lavender starch?" "Yes, it has a very distinctive scent. I noticed it some time ago. There is something particularly pleasant about lavender. I always think it suggests careful housekeeping." "I have used it for years," said Mrs. Melling. "Many people do." "Indeed." They walked another few steps. "I mentioned it only because I noticed on Saturday that there was a handkerchief near Mrs. Dunning's stall. Left behind, I suppose, in the bustle of the morning. It had that same scent quite distinctly. Lavender starch." Miss Marple paused, just enough. "I wondered whether it might have been yours. One loses such small things without noticing." There was a fractional silence. It was no more than a beat, perhaps less. A pause so slight that, in most conversations, it would have passed unmarked. But Miss Marple had long ago discovered that the smallest silences often contain the largest truths. A prepared lie may come fluently. A genuine denial may come at once. But a mind that must decide which of several truths to conceal sometimes pauses. "I don't believe so," said Mrs. Melling. "I have not lost a handkerchief recently." "Ah," said Miss Marple. "Then perhaps it belonged to someone else who shares your preference." "As I said, many people use lavender starch." "Yes, quite." They parted at the corner with all appropriate civility. Mrs. Melling went on toward her own house, upright, composed, unhurried. Miss Marple walked more slowly. She was thinking about the pause. She was also thinking about the handkerchief itself. She had seen it on Saturday morning near Mrs. Dunning's stall, not far from the left side where the basket had later stood. It had been white cotton, well made, with a simple hem-stitched edge. Good quality, though not ostentatious. It had been folded rather than crumpled, which interested her. A dropped handkerchief usually falls in some disorder. This one had lain with an air almost of intention, not proof. One had to be careful. A handkerchief might fall folded. It might be nudged by a foot. It might be picked up and set down by someone else. But it had smelled faintly of lavender starch. That was not nothing. A woman who starched her handkerchiefs with lavender did not treat them as disposable articles. Such a woman noticed linen. She tended it. She folded it correctly. She knew what was in her drawer and what was missing from it. If she lost a handkerchief, she would generally be aware of the loss, unless the handkerchief had not been lost, unless it had been left, in haste perhaps, or in agitation, or because it had served some purpose and then become inconvenient. Miss Marple's mind moved carefully around the possibility. Digitalis, a handkerchief, lavender starch. Could a handkerchief be involved? It seemed unlikely in any direct way. Poison was usually swallowed, not scented. Yet a handkerchief might wrap something, conceal something, wipe something, mark something, or it might merely place a person where they had no wish to be placed. The value of an object lay not only in what it was, but in where it had been. Mrs. Melling's composure returned to Miss Marple's mind. There are people naturally calm, people in whom emotional stillness is a gift of temperament. Mrs. Melling was not quite that. Her composure had the quality of maintenance. It was cared for, polished, adjusted, defended. It was the composure of someone who had learned that feeling too much in public was unsafe, and who had made control a habit. What would disturb such a woman? Not a general tragedy. Mrs. Melling could manage tragedy. She could produce suitable words, suitable pauses, suitable gravity. But a handkerchief, that had made a small breach. Miss Marple returned home by the lane that bordered the churchyard. The yew stood dark against the grey sky. A damp sweetness rose from the grass. The village had the washed, subdued look it often took on after low cloud, when colours seemed to come not from sunlight but from within themselves. At her gate she paused. Then she went inside and made a note in her small address book. Mrs. Beatrice Melling. She would call upon her properly later in the week. A domestic pretext would not be difficult. Eggs, perhaps, or butter, or a question about lavender starch, which was, after all, a perfectly respectable topic between women of careful housekeeping. Some truths were not found in official questioning. They were found in sitting rooms, among folded napkins, polished tables, and the expressions people wore when asked ordinary questions in ordinary voices. Miss Marple crossed to the small side table. There, wrapped in clean paper, lay the handkerchief. She had picked it up on Saturday evening, after the market had dispersed, and before anyone thought to trouble themselves with it. She had used a piece of paper, touching it as little as possible. Perhaps Inspector Slack would disapprove. Quite probably he would. But Inspector Slack had been looking at larger things, and larger things often cast shadows in which smaller things disappear. She unfolded the paper now. The handkerchief lay within, white and neat. The hem-stitching was fine and even, worked by hand. The cotton had been laundered many times but remained good. She lifted it toward the light, not touching it more than necessary. The lavender scent was faint, but present. There was something else too, perhaps. Or perhaps her imagination, alerted by the word digitalis, was becoming over-helpful. Miss Marple folded the paper back over the handkerchief and set it down. One must be very careful, she murmured. Then she went to make a fresh pot of tea, but as she waited for the kettle, she found herself thinking not only of Mrs. Melling's pause, but of the curious intimacy of linen. People lent money, borrowed sugar, exchanged jars, repeated gossip, and lied about their reasons for doing all of it. But a handkerchief belonged close to the person. It came from a pocket, a sleeve, a handbag. It carried scent. It carried habit. And sometimes, Miss Marple thought, it carried its owner into a place where that owner would very much prefer not to be found. Chapter 6. The box that someone moved and moved again. Wednesday brought the overcast to its natural conclusion. Rain began shortly after breakfast. It was light at first, a silvery stippling upon the windows, then steadier for an hour, laying a soft sheen over paths, leaves, roof tiles, and the low stone walls that bordered the lanes. By late morning the village had drawn itself indoors. Curtains moved faintly behind windows. Smoke rose more vertically than usual from chimneys. The green lay empty beneath the rain, its grass darkened and glistening. Miss Marple spent the wet hours inside. Her knitting lay in her lap, but she did not progress very far with it. Twice she counted stitches and found she had counted them correctly the first time. That, she reflected, was often a sign that the mind was occupied elsewhere, and hers was very much occupied elsewhere. Digitalis had settled one matter and disturbed several others. Mrs. Dunning had not merely been taken ill, she had been poisoned. That fact brought with it a dreadful clarity. Yet the method remained obscure. How had the poison been administered? At what moment? In what form? By whose hand? Miss Marple returned again and again to the same thought. The invisibility of ordinary exchanges. At a market stall things passed from person to person constantly. Coins, parcels, jars, cakes, paper bags, flowers, handkerchiefs, baskets, samples, cups of tea, written notes, borrowed pencils, returned string. One could stand in the middle of such a scene and see everything, yet remember almost nothing, because nothing had seemed worth remembering. That was the difficulty. If someone had forced Mrs. Dunning to swallow something, there would have been commotion. If someone had tampered openly with her goods, someone might have noticed. But if someone had handed her a small item under the natural cover of market familiarity, the act might vanish into the morning as completely as breath into air. The figure at the side of the stall, the handkerchief, the 3 florins, the basket. And now, perhaps, something beneath the stall itself. The rain cleared after luncheon. By early afternoon the clouds had lifted, leaving behind a washed brightness and that particular scent of damp earth, leaves, and opened flowers which Miss Marple had always found agreeable. She put on her coat and her sensible shoes and went out. Her steps, as she later might have said, had no fixed destination. Yet they carried her eventually to the lane by the allotments, where George Hollis kept a plot. George was there. He stood at the far end of the allotment with a fork in his hands, working the soil with a vigour that seemed less agricultural than emotional. His back was bent, his sleeves rolled, his face flushed. He had the air of a man who found relief in labour because thought, left unattended, had become troublesome. At the sound of the gate, he looked up. For a moment, Miss Marple saw his face before he rearranged it. Heavy, troubled, tired. Then the familiar openness returned. "Miss Marple," he called, "taking the air after the rain?" "The garden always looks so well after a good watering," said Miss Marple, "and the lanes are very pleasant before the dust returns." "Aye, they are." George set aside the fork and came toward her, wiping his hands upon his trousers. He was a man at ease with soil, fruit, crates, weather, and practical matters. Conversation of a direct sort suited him. Conversation with Miss Marple, however, had a way of becoming direct in directions one had not anticipated. She admired the bean canes. He straightened one almost immediately. "I've been thinking about Saturday," he said. Miss Marple had expected this. George Hollis was not a man built for concealment of feeling. He might conceal facts, perhaps, if there were some powerful reason for doing so, but grief, unease, irritation, affection, these rose in him like colour in the face. His sorrow over Mrs. Dunning was genuine. Whatever else he knew, that was not false. "I imagine many people have been thinking about it," said Miss Marple. "I keep going over the morning, wondering whether I noticed something I didn't notice, if you take my meaning." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "After such events, memory becomes rather like a room one has lived in for years but suddenly searches by candlelight. Corners appear that were always there." George looked at her with relief. "That's it. That's just it." He looked down at his hands. "The thing that keeps coming back to me is the crate. The crate? Under Clara's stall. Wooden crate, heavy built, rope handles. She used it for packing up at the end of the morning. Had it for years." Miss Marple waited. George bent to adjust another bean cane, though it did not appear urgently in need of adjustment. It was moved. In what way? Pushed back under the stall, further than usual, early in the morning, before 9, I'd say. Then later, perhaps an hour after, perhaps a little more, it was back where it should be. "You're certain it was the same crate?" "Certain. Dark stain on the left side. Oil, I think, from long ago. I've seen it often enough." He paused. "Clara kept it near the front edge under the stall. Not sticking out, mind, but reachable. She didn't like bending too far at the end of the morning. Said once she wasn't as young as she had been, though she'd have carried twice what I could, given the mood. But Saturday morning it was pushed right back. Then later it had been pulled forward again." "A crate moved twice," said Miss Marple. George nodded. "Someone moved it and then moved it back." "Did you see who?" There it was. The question sat between them, and George did not answer at once. He picked a bit of soil from his thumb. He looked toward the neighbouring allotment where no one was working. Then he looked back at Miss Marple with the uncomfortable honesty of a man who does not wish to accuse but cannot quite avoid telling. "I saw Arthur Pike near her stall twice." Miss Marple said nothing. "Once early," George went on, "around the time I noticed the crate had been pushed back, and again later, around when it was where it should be. Now, Arthur was in and out all morning. He always is. Fetching, carrying, talking. He's a helpful lad. I'm not saying he moved it. No. I don't want to be unfair. Of course not. But I saw him near there at those times, and with what's happened, well, I thought I should say." "You did quite right," said Miss Marple warmly. George looked relieved, but not comforted. Arthur wouldn't harm Clara. Miss Marple heard the sentence carefully. It was not quite the same as Arthur did not harm Clara. It was an appeal to character, not evidence. People often made that appeal when evidence had begun to trouble them. "No," she said gently, "it does not seem like Arthur." George seized upon the qualification. "But you think he knows something?" "I think," said Miss Marple, "that a great many people know something. The difficulty is that most of them do not yet know what they know." George frowned over that, then nodded slowly as if it made more sense the longer one considered it. He was fond of her in his way. She was kind to him. "Kindness," said Miss Marple, "can create obligations as well as gratitude." George looked at her sharply, but Miss Marple was admiring the beans again. The conversation moved by natural stages to weather, soil, and the disappointments of early peas. Then Miss Marple took her leave, thanking him for telling her about the crate. She walked home by the longer route. The old rectory wall still held a faint dampness from the rain. The wisteria had faded, but its ghost of scent lingered in the warm air. The churchyard grass shone with small beads of water. Everything looked washed clean, though Miss Marple knew better than to suppose that cleanliness of appearance had any necessary connection with innocence. A crate under a stall. Moved back, then forward. A space concealed by the fall of a cloth, accessible from the side, the same side where Arthur Pike had seen a person standing close to Mrs. Dunning, the same side where an ordinary customer had no particular reason to be. Miss Marple pictured the stall again. Front, jars, cakes, customers, coins, Mrs. Dunning's steady hands. Behind and beneath, boxes, packing materials, perhaps a crate. At the side, a narrow space through which someone familiar with the market could approach without attracting notice. If one wished to put something beneath a stall unseen, one might push a crate back to make room. If one wished later to retrieve that thing, one might pull the crate forward again to restore the appearance of normality. Or the reverse. Perhaps something had been hidden in the crate itself. Perhaps something had been taken from it. Perhaps the crate had served merely as a screen while another object changed hands. The difficulty lay in the second movement. Why move it back? Criminals, Miss Marple reflected, often betrayed themselves not by the thing they did, but by the thing they attempted to undo. A disturbance may pass unnoticed, but the restoration of order is sometimes too deliberate. It carries the mark of anxiety. A person who moved the crate back had noticed that it was wrong. That meant the person either knew Mrs. Dunning's habits well enough to restore them, or feared that someone else did. Arthur Pike moved freely among the stalls. No one questioned him. He was, as people often said, part of the Saturday morning furniture. He carried boxes, shifted crates, fetched tea, joked with George, accepted kindness from Mrs. Dunning. If he moved a crate, perhaps no one would think twice. And yet Arthur had not mentioned the crate. He had told Miss Marple about the figure at the side of the stall readily enough. He had described Mrs. Dunning's altered expression with a kind of awkward sincerity. But he had said nothing of being near the stall at the very times George Hollis had now supplied. Of course, innocent people omit things. They forget. They do not see the importance. They fear being misunderstood. Indeed, innocent people often behave more suspiciously than guilty ones, because they have not prepared their innocence in advance. Miss Marple smiled faintly at that thought. Still, Arthur Pike knew something. She was increasingly certain of it. Not necessarily something he had done. Perhaps something he had carried. Something he had been asked to move. Something he had seen without wishing to see it. Something he had accepted as a favour and later regretted. His anxiety had not been the anxiety of a murderer, Miss Marple thought, at least not as she had read it. There was no hardness in it, no secret calculation behind the eyes. It had been the anxiety of a young man standing too near something ugly and not knowing how to step away without revealing how close he had been. But anxiety, like string, could be followed. At her own gate, Miss Marple paused. The rain had brought out the scent of earth and roses. A robin hopped beneath the sweet peas, purposeful and indignant, as though the garden existed entirely for his convenience. The evening light had begun to gather gently along the windows of the cottages. Everything was peaceful. That, Miss Marple thought, was so often the most misleading thing about villages. She went inside, took out the small notebook she used when matters became too complex to be trusted to memory alone, and wrote 2 words: crate. Beneath it, after a pause, she wrote, reconsideration. She looked at the words for some time. A crate moved out of place suggested action. A crate moved back suggested fear, or second thoughts, or the completion of something planned in 2 stages. The kettle began to sing in the kitchen. Miss Marple did not rise immediately. She was thinking of Arthur Pike's face, George Hollis's reluctance, Mrs. Melling's pause, Miss Trent's exactness, and Clara Dunning's basket on the wrong side of the stall. Then she closed the notebook. "Not yet," she said softly, "but soon." And only then did she go to attend to the kettle. Chapter 7. Whispers, passing through the market rose. Thursday in St. Mary Mead was, by long-established village convention, the day upon which the Women's Institute met in the village hall for its fortnightly gathering. This particular Thursday proved no exception. That was one of the curious things about villages, Miss Marple often reflected. Even tragedy did not entirely interrupt their machinery. A death might darken conversation, lower voices, and send speculation moving beneath the surface like water under ice. But the appointed meeting still took place. Cakes were still sliced, chairs were still arranged in rows, minutes were still read. Someone still remembered that the urn had to be switched on early if tea was to be served at a respectable temperature. The village hall, with its polished floor, high windows, faded curtains, and framed notices from committees long dissolved, had known many varieties of human feeling. It had hosted whist drives, jumble sales, lectures on poultry keeping, temperance addresses, amateur theatricals, wartime comforts committees, and one memorable disagreement concerning the judging of marmalade which had left social bruises still detectable several years later. On this Thursday, the official subject was rosehip syrup. The demonstration proceeded with admirable competence. Mrs. Edna Farthing, wife of the churchwarden and a woman of unassailable practical seriousness, stood at the front with a saucepan, a cloth strainer, and several jars of prepared rosehips. She explained the importance of boiling, straining, and bottling with proper care, though it must be admitted that her audience followed the process with rather less attention than usual. The death of Mrs. Clara Dunning had not been formally introduced. It did not need to be. It was present in the room. It sat between chairs. It hovered over teacups. It inserted itself into pauses. It waited politely while rose hips were discussed, then returned the moment a sentence ended. That is the way of village tragedy. It does not require announcement, because everyone has already brought it with them. Miss Marple sat in her customary place near the window. The light there was good for needlework, and the position afforded, quite incidentally, an excellent view of the room as a whole. She worked at her knitting, listened, and contributed only when contribution seemed useful. Miss Marple had never believed in saying a great deal when saying little would do. There were people in St. Mary Mead who spoke in paragraphs and left no impression at all. Miss Marple, with one mild sentence, could sometimes shift the direction of an entire conversation. The demonstration ended. There was a practical discussion concerning storage bottles. Someone asked whether honey might be substituted for sugar. Someone else said it could, but should not. A third person recalled that during the war one had used whatever one could get, and the room nodded with the solemn agreement reserved for memories of collective inconvenience. Then tea was brought out. The formal meeting dissolved into smaller, more candid groups. It was at such moments, Miss Marple knew, that people ceased to speak for the room and began to speak for themselves. She found herself standing near the long table beside Mrs. Edna Farthing and Mrs. Ruth Baxter. Mrs. Baxter lived in the row of cottages nearest the green. She was 71, stout, comfortable, and possessed of a memory which had sharpened rather than softened with age. Her white hair was arranged in a style that had not altered since approximately 1938, and she had the air of a woman who had long ago concluded that unnecessary tact was a tax upon honesty. She was not unkind, but she did not decorate the truth. "I was there on Saturday," Mrs. Baxter said, with the quiet satisfaction of one whose presence at an important event had acquired retrospective significance. "Bought my eggs from Mrs. Melling at 8, as I always do. Stayed until nearly 11. Miss Marple accepted a cup of tea. "Yes?" "I heard something." Mrs. Farthing looked interested at once. Miss Marple did not look more interested than she had before. That was one of her gifts. "Did you?" she said. "Voices," said Mrs. Baxter. "Where?" Between the stalls, between Mrs. Dunning's stall and young Mrs. Hargreaves's flower stall, there is that narrow gap there, 3 feet perhaps, no more, enough for a person to stand if they did not mind being squeezed. Miss Marple saw the market again in her mind. Mrs. Dunning's stall, the left side, the basket later found forward and misplaced, the handkerchief near the ground, the side space not used by ordinary customers. Arthur Pike's unidentified figure. "At what time?" asked Miss Marple. "Not long before 10, I should say. I was at Mrs. Hargreaves's stall looking at Sweet Williams. I heard voices from the gap. Not words, mind you. I won't say I heard words when I did not, but voices. And the tone?" Mrs. Baxter drank her tea. It was not a delay caused by uncertainty. It was a delay used to arrange the statement properly. One voice was lower, kept low, measured, the sort of voice someone uses when saying something they have rehearsed. Miss Marple's fingers paused on the handle of her cup. And the other? Clara Dunning. I knew her voice well enough after 20 years. It was not comfortable. Not comfortable? No. Not frightened exactly. Not raised, but strained, as though she had been told something she did not wish to hear and was trying to answer with more calm than she felt. Mrs. Farthing drew in a sharp breath. Poor Clara! Mrs. Baxter nodded, but her expression remained firm. She was a woman with a steady voice, I noticed when it was not steady. "Could you say," Miss Marple asked, "whether the lower voice was a man's or a woman's?" Mrs. Baxter considered. This was one of the reasons Miss Marple valued her. Mrs. Baxter preferred accuracy to drama. "No," she said at last. Not with confidence. It was not deep, not a man's voice in the ordinary sense, but nor did it sound like a woman's voice as one commonly hears it. It was managed. "Managed," repeated Miss Marple softly. "Yes, kept low on purpose." That, Miss Marple thought, was a useful word. Managed implied intention, not merely quiet, not merely discreet, but controlled. A person may lower a voice out of habit, but a managed voice was altered for a reason. It suggested the speaker had wished not to be recognised by sound, perhaps by anyone nearby, perhaps by Mrs. Dunning herself at first, though that seemed less likely if they were speaking directly. "Did Mrs. Dunning sound angry?" Miss Marple asked. "No, that would have been easier to understand. She sounded held in, like a kettle. Just before it sings." Mrs. Farthing, who had been listening with increasing alarm, said, "How dreadful!" Mrs. Baxter looked at her. "Most things are dreadful once one knows what they meant." At this point, Mrs. Farthing remembered that she too had noticed something. "I did hear a sharper exchange," she said. "Not clearly. I was on the far side of the green at the time, near the refreshment table. I could not say where it came from, but I remember thinking someone sounded tense. Not quarrelling exactly, but intent." "Intent," said Miss Marple. "Yes. Then Mrs. Price asked me about the urn, and I quite forgot it." "That is very natural," said Miss Marple. "The ear notices many things before the mind has found a reason to preserve them." Mrs. Baxter looked at her with approval. "That is exactly it. I put it aside because it did not concern me. Then, of course, it concerned all of us." The conversation moved then, as conversations do, to other matters. Whether Mrs. Dunning had relatives who would come for the funeral, whether the stall would be taken by someone else, whether it would be tasteful to send flowers, whether Inspector Slack knew what he was doing. On this last point there was a polite diversity of opinion, though not so much diversity as Inspector Slack might have wished. Miss Marple listened. She learned, or confirmed, several things. Mrs. Baxter had heard voices near the left side of Mrs. Dunning's stall shortly before 10. One voice had been Clara Dunning's, strained and controlled. The other had been deliberately lowered, perhaps disguised. Mrs. Farthing had noticed tension in the general sound of the market at about the same period. Arthur Pike had seen a figure at the side of the stall. Miss Trent had seen Clara Dunning counting unexpected coins and frowning. George Hollis had noticed a crate moved and restored. Arthur himself had been near the stall at significant moments. The morning, once golden and innocent, was acquiring structure. After the meeting, the hall was tidied with the cooperative efficiency characteristic of the Women's Institute. Cups were collected, chairs pushed back, cloths shaken, the urn emptied, and a small discussion arose over who had left a spoon in the sugar bowl. Miss Marple helped fold a tablecloth, accepted a recipe for rosehip syrup she had no immediate intention of making, and walked home in the early evening light. The air had turned soft after the day's brightness. Shadows lengthened from the hedges. The church tower stood pale against a high blue sky. Somewhere a lawn-mower droned, paused, and started again with an indignant cough. Miss Marple walked slowly, a managed voice. The phrase stayed with her. People manage their voices when they do not wish to be themselves, or rather, when they wish to be recognised as little as possible. It is a difficult thing to do naturally. One must think of it. One must be composed enough to remember to do it, even while saying something of importance. That suggested premeditation, and yet Mrs. Dunning's responses had sounded strained, not prepared. She had not expected the conversation, or if she had expected some conversation, she had not expected its contents. Miss Marple had just reached her own gate when she saw Arthur Pike sitting on the low wall beside it. He stood up at once, too quickly. That quickness was revealing. It was partly courtesy, but mostly nerves. "Miss Marple," he said, "I hope you don't mind. I wanted to. There is something I should have said before." "Come in," said Miss Marple simply. "I shall make tea." There are confessions that cannot be hurried. Tea, Miss Marple had found, often helps them arrive at their own pace. Arthur followed her into the kitchen. He sat at the table, turning his cap in his hands. His face was pale beneath the outdoor colour, and he had the look of someone who had rehearsed a speech while walking, and had now discovered that rehearsed speeches become unreliable in the presence of another human being. Miss Marple filled the kettle, set cups on the table, and made the tea with her usual calm. Only when the cup stood before Arthur did she sit opposite him. She waited. Arthur looked at the tea. "Mrs. Melling came to me on Friday," he said at last. "Friday before the market?" "Yes." Miss Marple said nothing. "She asked me to do something, a small thing," she said. "Perfectly harmless. She said she would be grateful," he swallowed. "She gave me £0.50. That is a generous payment for a small, harmless thing." Arthur's face tightened. "I know that now. What did she ask you to do?" "She gave me a packet, small, wrapped in brown paper and tied with string, about the size of a jar, perhaps a little smaller. She asked me to place it under Mrs. Dunning's stall early in the morning before trade got busy, in the space by the crate." "The crate that Mrs. Dunning kept beneath the stall?" "Yes." "What did Mrs. Melling say the packet was?" "A gift, something she wanted Mrs. Dunning to find. A kind of surprise. She said she and Mrs. Dunning had known each other a long time, and she wanted to do something thoughtful but did not want to make a fuss." "And you believed her?" Arthur looked up. It sounded reasonable. People do odd little kind things, don't they? Especially in villages. Leaving things, putting aside things. And Mrs. Dunning was kind. I thought perhaps Mrs. Melling was being kind in her own way. Miss Marple considered that. Mrs. Melling being kind in her own way was not impossible. Very few things are impossible. But it was not the first explanation one would reach for. He placed the packet. "Yes, early, before 9. I moved the crate back a little to make space and put the packet beside it. Then I went away. And later, around 10, perhaps a little after, I went back." "Why?" Arthur turned the cap more tightly. "I don't know, not properly. Something had begun to bother me. At first I thought it was the money, £0.50. Too much for the favour. Then I thought perhaps Mrs. Melling had been strange when she gave me the packet. Not nervous exactly, but very definite, as if it mattered that I did it exactly as she said, and she told me not to mention it to anyone because that would spoil the surprise." "Ah," said Miss Marple. "So I went back, just to see." "And the packet?" "It was gone. The crate, back where it usually was." "Who moved it?" "I don't know. I didn't see. I told myself Mrs. Dunning had found the packet and moved the crate back, that everything had happened as Mrs. Melling said. He looked at her then directly. But it hadn't, had it? It was not really a question. No, said Miss Marple very gently. I do not think it had. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, a wood pigeon made its repetitive and mournful statement from somewhere near the apple tree. The evening light lay in a long rectangle upon the floorboards. Arthur sat very still, his hands around the cap. I should have known. One does not always know what one should know at the time. She paid me. She told me not to mention it. I should have known. A person often recognises significance only after events have given it shape, said Miss Marple. That is not the same as guilt. Arthur shook his head. But I helped. Yes, said Miss Marple. She did not soften the word. It would not have been kind to do so. Arthur flinched slightly, then nodded. Yes, I helped. You did not know what you were helping? No, but I did not ask. Miss Marple looked at him with compassion, but also with firmness. Then you must ask now, in the only way left to you. You must tell Inspector Slack. Arthur's shoulders dropped, not in defeat, but in the relief of surrendering to something unavoidable. I know. Tomorrow morning would be best. Tomorrow? Yes, before you can think yourself into another delay. The smallest ghost of a smile crossed Arthur's face and vanished. You understand people, don't you, Miss Marple? I have lived in a village for a long time, said Miss Marple. That is much the same thing. Arthur drank his tea. When he left, he looked older than when he had arrived, but steadier. There are moments in life when a person passes from anxious concealment into honest fear, and the latter, painful though it is, has a cleaner air. Miss Marple stood at the kitchen window until she heard the gate click behind him. Then she washed both cups. Afterward she went into the sitting room, took out her writing paper, and wrote a letter to Inspector Slack. She chose each word carefully. Inspector Slack did not like being told what to think. Therefore, one must not tell him. One must arrange the facts in such a way that they walked him, with dignity, to the proper door. The packet under the stool, Arthur Pike's part in placing it, Mrs. Melling's direction, the figure at the side of the stall, the managed voice, the 3 florins, the handkerchief with lavender starch, the crate moved twice. She did not write the word murder until the end, and even then, only in relation to the medical evidence already established. When the letter was finished, she folded it neatly, lengthwise first, then across. Because one's manner of folding paper, Miss Marple thought, could sometimes reveal a great deal. Chapter 8. A slip of paper folded the wrong way round. Friday arrived bright and clear. After the week's uncertainty of weather and feeling, the morning seemed almost determined to be pleasant. Sunlight came early over the roofs of St. Mary Mead and settled on window panes, garden walls, and the wet edges of leaves. The village appeared from a distance restored to innocence. That, Miss Marple thought, was one of the more dangerous services sunlight performed. It made things look clean. She had slept well, which she considered a good sign. Her conscience was at ease with what she had done the previous evening. The letter to Inspector Slack had been written, sealed, and delivered by hand before 9 o'clock. She had taken it herself to the police station and left it with the constable on duty, requesting that it be given to Inspector Slack upon his arrival. The constable had looked impressed by the envelope, though whether because of its neatness, or because Miss Marple had said, "Upon his arrival, if you please," in a tone that made alternatives difficult, she could not say. She had written the letter carefully. She had not accused Mrs. Melling. That would have been premature, and Inspector Slack would have resisted it on principle. Instead, she had set out facts, placed in their most useful order. First the packet, because Arthur Pike's statement was concrete, then Mrs. Melling's request, then the crate, then the figure at the side of the stall, then Mrs. Baxter's managed voice, then the handkerchief, the florins, the basket, and Mrs. Dunning's disturbed habits. Inspector Slack, Miss Marple had learned, received conclusions most willingly when permitted to feel he had reached them unaided. Therefore, one must leave him a clear path and avoid standing visibly at the end of it. She had just returned home and was considering whether to cut more roses when Inspector Slack arrived at her door. It was 10 o'clock, rather sooner than she had expected. He did not have his notebook. That interested her. A policeman without his notebook was either off duty or thinking. Inspector Slack was plainly not off duty. "Miss Marple," he said. "Good morning, Inspector. Do come in." He came in and sat in the upright chair as usual, but his manner differed. He looked less impatient than concentrated, less irritated than obliged to reconsider. "Your letter," he said. "Yes." "Arthur Pike came in this morning before I'd read it. He was waiting when I arrived. I thought he might be. He struck me as a young man who, once he'd made up his mind, would not delay." Inspector Slack looked at her. "He told me about the packet, about Mrs. Melling approaching him on Friday evening. The details correspond with what you wrote." "They would," said Miss Marple pleasantly. A flicker of expression passed across Inspector Slack's face and vanished. "The difficulty," he said, "is that a packet placed under a stall is not in itself proof of poisoning. We do not have the packet. We do not know its contents. We have the medical findings naturally, but Mrs. Melling will not say anything she does not have to say." "No," said Miss Marple, "she will not." "She denies asking Pike to place anything under the stall." "Does she?" "She admits speaking to him on Friday evening. Says she asked whether he would help carry a crate the following morning if needed." "That was not very imaginative," said Miss Marple. Inspector Slack looked at her sharply. "Miss Marple, I beg your pardon." But she did not look especially repentant. "She is a careful woman," Miss Marple continued. "She will continue to be careful now. One's habits do not leave one merely because they become inconvenient." Inspector Slack sat back. Not comfortably, but enough to suggest that he was willing for the moment to listen. "You mentioned a handkerchief." "Yes." Miss Marple rose and went to the small side table in the corner of the sitting room. She returned with the handkerchief, still folded as she had found it, laid upon the sheet of white paper on which she'd carried it. She set it before him. Inspector Slack stared. Then he stared at her. "You took this from the scene." "I placed it on paper and carried it very carefully, touching it as little as possible." "You removed evidence." "I preserved a possible object of significance before it could be swept away, stepped upon, or taken by someone who might have had more reason than I did to remove it." Inspector Slack's expression contained several thoughts, none of them comfortable. "You really ought not to have done that." "No," said Miss Marple, "I quite see that." Her agreement did not improve his mood. He looked down at the handkerchief. "It is good quality. Hem-stitched by hand. Lavender starched." "Mrs. Melling?" "When I mentioned it to her on Tuesday, quite naturally, she denied having lost a handkerchief." There was a pause before she answered. "People pause." "Yes, but not all pauses are the same." Inspector Slack made a sound that was not agreement, but had begun the journey toward it. "You think it is hers?" "I think it would be useful to establish whether she owns handkerchiefs of the same kind, and whether one is missing." "That is being looked into." "Good." Miss Marple sat down again. "There is also the receipt." Inspector Slack's face altered. "Yes, I was going to ask you about that. It was found in Mrs. Dunning's apron pocket, I understand." "How did you understand that?" "Constables are often very obliging without intending to be indiscreet." "I see. I am not sure that you do." Inspector Slack looked at her, then decided with visible effort not to pursue this. "The receipt," he said. "You wrote that it was folded the wrong way." "Yes." "That sounds on the face of it a small matter." "It is a small matter." "Then why is it important?" "Because Mrs. Dunning was made of small matters." Inspector Slack was silent. Miss Marple continued gently. "She folded papers lengthwise first, always. Shopping lists, notes, receipts, church notices. Several people could confirm it. It was the natural movement of her hands. The receipt found in her pocket had been folded across the width first. That could happen. Certainly, almost anything could happen once. But when a woman is particular in all her habits, and when she dies after being poisoned, and when several other things around her have been placed or moved contrary to her habits, one begins to treat departures from habit with respect. Inspector Slack looked at the floor. What conclusion do you draw? The simplest. That Mrs. Dunning did not fold that receipt. Someone else folded it and placed it in her pocket. After she was dead? Possibly after she was unable to notice, or at a moment when she was too distracted to object. But I think after she was no longer in command of herself is more likely. Why place it there? To make it appear that she had received it in the ordinary course of things, perhaps. Or to return something which had become dangerous to possess, or to create confusion about how and when it came to her. Inspector Slack's mouth tightened. A receipt for what? That I do not know with certainty, but you have an idea. Yes, Miss Marple folded her hands. Mrs. Melling sells eggs and butter of local provenance. She's careful to emphasize their quality. She collects money orders and deals regularly with suppliers. If there were a receipt showing that some of the goods she represented as local were purchased from elsewhere, or that butter sold as farm butter came from a commercial supplier, that might be embarrassing. Embarrassing enough for murder? Embarrassment alone? No. Exposure, perhaps. Loss of livelihood, loss of reputation, a previous deceit discovered, a threat made in anger, an old resentment sharpened by fear. Human motives are seldom pure. They are generally mixtures. Inspector Slack looked at the handkerchief again. You think Mrs. Dunning discovered something about Mrs. Melling's trade? I think it is a question worth asking thoroughly. I think the supplier named on that receipt, the date, the goods listed, and the amount paid may tell you a great deal, particularly if compared with what Mrs. Melling sold at the market that morning and on previous Saturdays. Inspector Slack rose. His movement had purpose now. That was good. He picked up the handkerchief, paper and all, with more care than he might have shown 10 minutes earlier. I shall need this. Yes. And I shall need to know exactly where you found it. I can show you. You should have told me earlier. Yes, said Miss Marple. I considered that afterward. He looked at her. She looked back, mild and undisturbed. At last he said, You really are a very difficult woman, Miss Marple. So my nephew Raymond has occasionally suggested, though usually when I found something in one of his manuscripts that he hoped no one would notice. Inspector Slack almost smiled. Almost. Then he put on his hat. I am going to speak to Mrs. Melling again. I think that would be wise. At the door he turned. One more thing. Pike says the packet was about the size of a jar, wrapped in brown paper. Yes? If it contained digitalis, there must have been something to carry it in. A bottle, perhaps, or food. Something Mrs. Dunning would handle or consume. Or something she was meant to think had been left for her. Inspector Slack considered that. A gift? Yes. People accept gifts differently from purchases. In what way? With less suspicion, said Miss Marple. He left. She listened to his footsteps on the path, and then to the click of the garden gate. For a few moments the cottage was very quiet. Then the ordinary sounds returned. A distant lawn-mower, a dog expressing firm views about the postman, the wood-pigeon in the garden continuing its repetitive declarations to the world. Miss Marple took up her knitting. The picture was largely assembled now, though a picture is not the same as proof. Proof must be gathered by official hands. Inspector Slack, for all his impatience, was a capable man when once turned in the correct direction. He would trace the receipt. He would examine Mrs. Melling's supplies. He would question Arthur Pike again. He would perhaps, with some reluctance, admit the importance of folded paper and lavender starch. There remained, however, the deeper question. Why had it begun? Not why had Mrs. Dunning died? That, Miss Marple felt, was becoming horribly clear. But why had the first threat, the first fear, the first desperate thought appeared in Mrs. Melling's mind? What had Clara Dunning discovered? Had she meant to expose it? Had she merely confronted a neighbour in the hope of correcting a wrong? Had she underestimated the terror of a person whose respectability rested upon concealment? Murder, Miss Marple had often found, rarely began with murder. It began earlier, with a lie told because it was convenient, with money taken because it would soon be put back, with a label written more attractively than truth allowed, with pride, with shame, with the belief that one small deception could be managed, and then another, until truth itself became the danger. She counted her stitches. They were correct. Outside, sunlight lay bright upon the roses. Miss Marple knitted on, waiting for the next conversation, the one which, she felt, could not be very far away. Chapter 9. All that lay hidden in the early hush. Saturday came round again. Weeks have that peculiar cruelty. They proceed with absolute punctuality, regardless of what has occurred within them. A death may disturb a village, unsettle a household, rearrange affections, expose lies, and alter forever the meaning of an ordinary place. But Saturday arrives when Saturday is due, and the market opens because people must still buy eggs, butter, strawberries, thread, lavender and bread. So the morning market opened in St. Mary Mead. At first glance it might have been any other June Saturday. The green was bright with early sunlight. The stalls stood in their familiar crescent at the eastern edge, their canvas shades stirred by a faint breeze, their goods arranged with varying degrees of care and pride. There were greetings called from one stall to another, the creak of crates being set down, the clink of jars, the soft thud of loaves placed upon boards, the rustle of paper bags, and the subdued but persistent murmur of village commerce. But nothing was quite the same. Mrs. Dunning's stall stood empty. The trestle was there, but bare. No cream linen cloths, no handwritten labels turned precisely outward, no jars of strawberry, damson, gooseberry and quince, no shortbread fingers set at their little diagonal. No mild, pleasant woman standing behind the display with capable hands and a word of remembered kindness for almost everyone. People passed the empty place with a slight alteration of pace. Some slowed, some looked away, some looked too directly. That, Miss Marple thought, was often the way with absence. It had no body, yet it changed the movement of everyone around it. Mrs. Beatrice Melling was present behind her own stall. Eggs, butter, a neat display, a quiet manner, a dark dress, suitable without being mourning, gloves folded beside the till, face composed, voice level. To anyone uninstructed, she looked very much as she had always looked, but Miss Marple knew better than to trust composure merely because it had been well maintained. She arrived at 8:15, as was her habit, with her basket on her arm and her gloves properly buttoned. She bought thread from Mrs. Hargreaves, the wrong weight, as she discovered later, which was not like her, but then one cannot observe a whole village and thread at the same time with equal success. She accepted a cup of tea from the Women's Institute table and drank it standing beneath the elm, where she could see the market without appearing to watch it. Her gaze did not rest long upon Mrs. Melling. That would have been unnecessary. One learns more, very often, by looking elsewhere. At 9:00, Dolly Bantry arrived on the early bus, slightly breathless and quite unable to conceal that she had come in expectation of something. "My dear Jane," she said, falling into step beside Miss Marple, "you told me to come this morning. So I came. Is anything going to happen?" "A great deal has already happened," said Miss Marple. "Yes, but I mean this morning." "That depends largely upon Inspector Slack." Dolly glanced toward Mrs. Melling's stall with the transparent air of someone pretending to evaluate eggs. "Has he done what you wanted?" "What I hoped," said Miss Marple. "Inspector Slack is a thorough man when the direction is sufficiently definite." "That sounds as though you have pointed him at something." "I have arranged certain facts in a convenient order." "Jane?" "My dear, men dislike being led. but they often do not object to finding a path already swept. Dolly gave a small laugh, then sobered. "Shall we talk?" "Yes," said Miss Marple. "Let us walk." They moved away from the centre of the market toward the quieter end of the green, where the old elm spread its shade and the sound of buying and selling became softened by distance. Miss Marple walked slowly, not from age alone, but because the reconstruction of a thing requires a suitable pace. "The market," she began, "is a place of habit. That is what gives it its comfort. People come at the same time. They stand in the same places. They buy from the same stalls. They make the same remarks about weather, prices, quality, and whether strawberries were better last year. It appears casual, but it is not casual at all. It is a pattern repeated week after week until everyone knows it without knowing they know it." Dolly said nothing. She had learned that when Miss Marple began with general truths, she was generally preparing to arrive at a very particular one. Mrs. Dunning, Miss Marple continued, was part of that pattern. More than part of it. She was one of its fixed points. Her stall was not merely where she sold preserves and cakes. It was an expression of her character. Orderly, deliberate, honest, particular. When that order altered on Saturday morning, even slightly, it meant something had disturbed her. The basket. Yes, the basket first, set forward and left where she would not have set it. Then the coins, counted twice, the florins among her takings, then the report that she seemed distracted, then the voice heard between the stalls, then Arthur's figure at the side, then the packet beneath the stall. Dolly drew in a breath. "When you say it one after another—" "Yes," said Miss Marple. "That is often the difficulty. Separately such things look very small. Together they begin to speak." They paused to allow a woman with a large basket to pass along the narrow path. The woman smiled, lowered her voice instinctively as she passed the empty trestle, and then resumed talking once she had moved beyond it. Miss Marple watched her for a moment. "Mrs. Dunning was not ill in the way Inspector Slack first supposed," she said. "Illness may produce weakness, confusion, collapse, but it does not usually produce a pattern of small departures, all connected to the same point in time. What we saw was distraction. A woman whose attention had been seized by something unexpected." "Confronted," said Dolly. "Yes, but I think not entirely surprised. That is important. Mrs. Dunning had already been thinking about Mrs. Melling." Dolly looked at her sharply. "You mean the butter and eggs?" "Yes. Mrs. Melling had built her reputation upon quality. Locally sourced eggs, excellent butter, reliable produce, all presented with that rather chilly confidence of hers. People paid accordingly. Reputation in a village is a kind of currency. Mrs. Melling spent hers very carefully." "And it was false?" "Partly false. That is often worse in some ways because partial falsehood hides more comfortably among truths. Some of her goods may have been exactly as she represented them. Others, I believe Inspector Slack has by now confirmed, came from cheaper suppliers outside the district and were sold under the shelter of her established name." Dolly's face showed frank indignation. "That is dishonest." "Yes, quietly dishonest, persistently dishonest, and profitable enough over time to matter." "And Clara Dunning found out?" "I believe she had begun to find out. She was herself a market woman. She understood quality, pricing, supply, habit. She had bought from Mrs. Melling. She would have noticed inconsistencies. An egg not quite what it claimed to be. Butter of a texture or taste that did not correspond with its advertised origin. Small things, but Clara Dunning was a woman who respected small things. The receipt. Yes." Miss Marple stopped walking and looked across the green. The morning had grown fuller now. Children moved between adults. George Hollis was serving customers at his fruit stall, subdued but kindly. Miss Trent stood nearby, notebook in hand, watching a weighing of plums with the moral attention of a magistrate. Arthur Pike, pale but steadier than he had looked earlier in the week, carried a crate for Mrs. Hargreaves, and then moved away quickly, as though wary of ever again being too useful. "Mrs. Dunning had a receipt," Miss Marple said. Whether she obtained it by accident, by inquiry, or through someone else who suspected the truth, I do not yet know, but it linked Mrs. Melling to a supplier whose goods were not what she represented to her customers. Mrs. Dunning was gathering facts before deciding what to do. She would not have exposed someone carelessly, said Dolly. No, she was not cruel, but she was honest. There are honest people who enjoy exposing wrongdoing. Clara Dunning was not one of them. She would have disliked the necessity, but she would not have allowed herself to be bribed into silence. The 3 florins. Yes, I believe they were an offer. A bribe? A small one, perhaps intended to become larger, or perhaps not meant as a sufficient sum in itself, but as the opening of a negotiation, a way of saying, let us settle this privately. Let us not make trouble. Here is something for your silence. Dolly looked toward Mrs. Melling's stall, and Clara refused. I think she was offended. Miss Marple's voice was gentle, but the word carried weight. People like Mrs. Melling sometimes misunderstand people like Clara Dunning. They imagine that because a person is kind, she is pliable. Because she is modest, she can be managed. Because she is not socially forceful, she will yield to a stronger will. But goodness is not weakness. In certain people, it is very nearly the opposite. Dolly's eyes softened. Poor Clara. Yes. Around them the market went on. That was the strangest part of it. The murderer stood among eggs and butter, within earshot of greetings and the clatter of coins, while the explanation of a death unfolded beneath an elm on a fine June morning. A child somewhere was asking with increasing urgency whether biscuits might be purchased. Mrs. Price was laughing too loudly near the flower stall. The vicar's wife was comparing lavender prices. Ordinary life, Miss Marple thought, was never interrupted for as long as one expected. It merely continued, carrying secrets in its pockets. Mrs. Melling had prepared something, Miss Marple said. The packet? Yes. She approached Arthur Pike the evening before the market and used his good nature. She gave him £0.50, told him it was a harmless little matter, and asked him to place a packet beneath Mrs. Dunning's stall, beside the crate before the morning became busy. What did she say it was? A gift, a surprise. How wicked, Dolly said. It was practical, said Miss Marple. Wickedness often is. Dolly shivered slightly, though the morning was warm. Arthur did not know. No, he knew only afterward that something was wrong. He returned later and found the packet gone and the crate restored. His uneasiness began then. But uneasiness is not knowledge, and young people often mistrust their own instincts when an older, respectable person has given them instructions. And the voice Mrs. Baxter heard? Mrs. Melling, I think. Managed, lowered, rehearsed. She spoke to Mrs. Dunning at the side of the stall, not at the front. The side offered privacy without concealment. Very clever in its way. In a public place, people assume there can be nothing secret. What did she say? That we may never know exactly. But I believe she attempted to persuade Mrs. Dunning to keep silent. Perhaps she spoke of misunderstanding, perhaps of ruin, perhaps of age and hardship, and how everyone must manage as best they can. People defending a wrong often find touching language for it. And Clara would have been calm, but firm. Miss Marple looked toward the empty trestle. That, I think, sealed the matter. Dolly was quiet. The phrase seemed to hang in the warm air between them. What happened next? She asked. Fear took charge. Miss Marple resumed walking and Dolly followed. I do not think Mrs. Melling's plan was as complete as it may appear now. A truly cold and careful plan would have been less clumsy. The handkerchief, the wrong fold of the receipt, the basket left in the wrong place, the florins, these are not the traces of a perfectly controlled mind. They are the traces of a person trying desperately to make events look ordinary after they had ceased to be so. But she had the poison. Yes, that is why I say preparation existed before full intention. She had obtained digitalis. She had considered possibilities. Fear had already led her some distance down the path before she admitted where she was going. Then the packet contained something Mrs. Dunning would accept, or open, or handle in trust. Miss Marple did not elaborate. There was no need. Dolly understood enough, and the full mechanics of cruelty did not require decoration. "The receipt in Mrs. Dunning's pocket," Dolly said after a moment, "placed afterward, folded by someone who did not know Mrs. Dunning's habit of folding papers lengthwise first. It may have been meant to suggest some irregularity of Clara's own, or merely to dispose of a document that had become dangerous. Frightened people are not always coherent. They cover one thing and expose another. And the handkerchief, not planned, dropped, I think, or set down in agitation. A small thing abandoned by a mind busy with larger terrors. That is why small things are so useful. They are often beneath the notice of guilt." They had come nearer the centre of the market again. Mrs. Melling stood behind her stall. She was not serving anyone at that moment. Her hands rested upon the edge of the table. Her face remained composed, but there was a stillness in her that did not belong to calm. It belonged to waiting. Miss Marple saw it. So did Dolly. "She knows," Dolly whispered. "She suspects," said Miss Marple. "There is a difference, but not a comfortable one. Will Inspector Slack come here?" "I believe so." They moved away before their observation could become conspicuous. At George Hollis's stall they bought strawberries. George gave them a generous measure, more than they had paid for. He said nothing sentimental about Clara Dunning, but his hands, as he weighed the fruit, were careful and gentle. "Good berries this week," he said gruffly. "They look excellent," said Miss Marple. She always liked the first. "Proper June strawberries," George said. Then he looked embarrassed, as though he had said too much. Miss Marple smiled. She would have appreciated these. George nodded and turned to another customer. Dolly and Miss Marple took a second cup of tea near the Women's Institute table. The market continued around them, subdued, curious, resilient. A village, Miss Marple thought, remembers in ways it does not admit. Not formally, not in records, but in habits, in repetitions, in absences, in the way people glance at an empty stall and then look away. It had remembered Mrs. Dunning, and it had remembered everything that did not fit. At Mrs. Melling's stall, the butter lay in its neat blocks, and the eggs in their orderly trays. The display was as carefully arranged as ever. Behind it, Mrs. Melling stood very still. Not the stillness of peace, the stillness of a person listening for approaching footsteps. Chapter 10. A Market That Forgets Nothing. The vicarage drawing room was, on that particular Saturday afternoon, a quiet and suitable place for a conversation of consequence. The vicar's wife, who possessed both practical intelligence and a tact superior to many people who prided themselves upon refinement, had arranged tea and then withdrawn. She did this so naturally that no one could have accused her of retreating from difficulty. Rather, she'd recognised that the room was needed, and had given it over with the calm efficiency of a woman who knew the value of privacy. The room itself was pleasant in the early summer afternoon. The fireplace, unused now, had been dressed with dried flowers and a small arrangement of greenery that gave off a faint herbal scent. Sunlight lay across the carpet in long golden panels. Through the open window came the soft sounds of the market nearing its close. Stalls being packed away, crates shifted, voices lowered by distance, the occasional laugh arriving from the green and fading before it reached the room. Inspector Slack sat nearest the empty fireplace. His notebook lay closed upon his knee. That, Miss Marple observed, was significant. Dolly Bantry sat on the sofa, upright and attentive, her gloves folded in her lap. She had been present at enough of Miss Marple's explanations to know that one ought not interrupt too soon, though the effort occasionally cost her something. Miss Marple herself sat near the window, knitting in her hands though she was not knitting. For a few moments no one spoke. Then Inspector Slack said, "Mrs. Melling has been spoken to." It was a careful phrase, a policeman's phrase. It indicated that certain formal steps had been taken without yet announcing all their consequences. "At some length," he added. Miss Marple inclined her head. She would be careful. She was? She has always been careful. Inspector Slack glanced at her. Yes, that has become increasingly apparent. He opened the notebook after all, not because he needed it, Miss Marple thought, but because a notebook gave structure to uncomfortable human facts. The supplier has been identified. The receipt found in Mrs. Dunning's pocket was not, as it first appeared, an isolated document. We recovered others from Mrs. Melling's premises during a thorough examination yesterday. They name a firm in the next county. The produce supplied was of considerably inferior grade to what Mrs. Melling represented at the market. Dolly gave a little sound of indignation. Inspector Slack continued. She had maintained the arrangement for the better part of 2 years, not with all her goods, which made the deception harder to detect, but sufficiently often to profit. She sold under the reputation she had built, local, superior quality, carefully sourced, while paying substantially less for much of what she actually provided. A quiet and persistent deception, said Miss Marple. Yes, said Inspector Slack. That is exactly what it was. He looked faintly annoyed that she had phrased it better. The margins were not enormous in any single week, but accumulated over 2 years, with regular Saturday trade and prices set according to her reputation, the amount became significant. Enough to matter, said Dolly. Enough to matter very much to a woman whose respectability and livelihood were tied together, said Miss Marple. Inspector Slack nodded. Dolly leaned forward. But how did Mrs. Dunning discover it? We believe she noticed first as a customer, said Inspector Slack. She had bought butter from Mrs. Melling on several occasions for her own household. Mrs. Dunning was experienced in such matters. She knew quality. She knew what people claimed, what they charged, and what they supplied. Over several weeks she apparently noticed inconsistencies. Clara would, said Miss Marple. She made inquiries, Inspector Slack continued. We found a letter among her papers at home, addressed to a supplier in the district asking for information about provenance and delivery. Very discreet but direct enough. She was gathering facts. Before deciding what to do, said Miss Marple. Yes, she was not a woman who acted impulsively. There was respect in Inspector Slack's voice now. That pleased Miss Marple, not for her own sake but for Clara Dunning's. It matters after death that one is understood correctly by the living. We think Mrs. Melling became aware of it, he said, either because she heard something or because Mrs. Dunning's manner changed toward her. The village is small. A woman asking quiet questions does not remain unnoticed for long. No, said Miss Marple, especially not by someone already afraid of being found out. Inspector Slack looked down at the closed notebook. Mrs. Baxter's statement about the voices fits the timing. Mrs. Melling approached Mrs. Dunning at the side of the stall, in the gap between Mrs. Dunning's stall and the flower stall, not at the front. She kept her voice low. Managed, as Mrs. Baxter put it. She had rehearsed it, said Miss Marple. I think so. And the 3 florins. A bribe, in effect. Or the opening of one. Dolly's face hardened. Clara would have hated that. She appears to have refused, said Inspector Slack. Firmly. Possibly with more moral force than Mrs. Melling expected. Miss Marple pictured it. Clara Dunning behind her stall, surrounded by the small, honest products of her work. Preserves, shortbread, cakes, lavender. Mrs. Melling standing close at the side, controlled and urgent. Money offered. Silence requested. Fear hidden beneath respectability. And Clara, kind but immovable. There are moments when a person's whole character gathers itself into a single refusal. This, Miss Marple thought, had been Clara Dunning's. Inspector Slack went on. Mrs. Melling had already made preparation. That much is clear. She obtained digitalis through a contact who had no reason at the time to suspect misuse. The packet Arthur Pike placed under the stall contained a preparation mixed into something Mrs. Dunning would accept as a neighbourly offering. He stopped there. Miss Marple was grateful. There was no need to make cruelty vivid. Arthur Pike was used, Dolly said. Yes, said Inspector Slack. He placed the packet in good faith, believing it to be a gift. He has given a full statement, There is no evidence that he knew anything of its purpose. He will suffer for that ignorance all the same, said Miss Marple. Inspector Slack looked at her. Yes, I think he already is. Outside, a cart rattled over the lane. The sound came and went. Mrs. Dunning opened the packet behind her stall, Inspector Slack said. At some point after the conversation, she consumed enough of what was inside for the result we know. There was no disturbance. By the time she was found, Mrs. Melling had returned to her own stall and was observed there by several people. And then, said Miss Marple, she tried to restore the appearance of order. Inspector Slack's mouth tightened. Yes, badly, but not obviously badly. Not unless one knew Mrs. Dunning's habits. The crate was moved back. Yes, the basket misplaced. Likely during the confusion of either the packet's removal or the later attempt to tidy what should not have been touched. The receipt placed in Mrs. Dunning's pocket. Inspector Slack nodded. That seems clear now. The receipt found in the apron pocket was not the most incriminating one. It was from Mrs. Dunning's own supplier. It may have been intended to suggest some irregularity on Mrs. Dunning's part if anyone began asking about receipts and sourcing, or perhaps Mrs. Melling panicked and placed the wrong thing where she thought it would confuse matters. It was not coherent. No, said Miss Marple. Fear is seldom tidy. Folded the wrong way, said Dolly softly. Miss Marple looked at her. Yes, that was the thing. Clara Dunning folded papers lengthwise first. Mrs. Melling did not know that, or did not remember it under pressure. So she folded the receipt in her own way, or in no particular way, and placed it where Clara would have placed nothing of the kind. Inspector Slack gave Miss Marple a look that, in another man, might almost have been admiration openly expressed. The handkerchief helped, he said. It matched others found at Mrs. Melling's house. Same cotton, same hem-stitching, same lavender starch, one missing from the set. And she had said she had not lost one, said Miss Marple. She had. A pity, said Miss Marple. Dolly looked at her. For Mrs. Melling? For everyone, said Miss Marple, but especially for people who imagine that denying a small truth will save them from a larger one. Inspector Slack closed his notebook. Mrs. Melling has not made a full confession. Not yet. But the evidence is substantial. The supplier records, Arthur Pike's statement, Mrs. Baxter's voices, the handkerchief, the receipt, the medical findings, the inconsistencies at the stall. It is enough. Dolly let out a long breath. An ordinary Saturday morning, she said. That is what feels so strange. Everyone buying things, chatting, drinking tea, and all the while... Yes, said Miss Marple, but ordinary places are often where people feel safest. Therefore, they are least careful. She said it quietly, without drama. There was no triumph in the room. That was one thing Dolly Bantry had always noticed about Miss Marple's conclusions. They brought clarity, but not satisfaction. The truth, once revealed, did not make murder less terrible. It merely prevented it from being disguised as something else. Inspector Slack rose. I should say, he began, then paused. Miss Marple looked up. Yes, Inspector. The handkerchief, the receipt, Arthur Pike, the market habits. You saw a good deal that I did not see at first. You would have seen it, said Miss Marple kindly. Inspector Slack made a small sound. I am not at all sure I would. The evidence was there. Yes, he said, but you knew how to read it. Miss Marple's expression softened. I knew Clara Dunning's kind of mind. That helped. Inspector Slack accepted this with a brief nod. He put on his hat and moved toward the door with the purposeful air of a man who had much formal business still ahead of him. At the threshold he turned. Miss Marple? Yes. You're a very difficult woman. So you have mentioned before, Inspector. This time, he said, I intend it as a compliment. Miss Marple smiled. Then I shall accept it as one. He left. They heard his steps on the path, then the closing of the gate. The room settled again into the sounds of the late afternoon. A faint breeze at the window, the distant packing of market stalls, the small domestic noises from elsewhere in the vicarage. Dolly remained on the sofa. For once she did not speak at once. Miss Marple set down her knitting and folded it carefully. Poor Clara Dunning, Dolly said at last. She had done nothing wrong, she noticed. She asked questions. She refused to be dishonest, that was all. Yes, said Miss Marple, it seems so unfair. It is unfair. Miss Marple looked out toward the vicarage garden, where the early summer light lay warm upon the lawn. She was a good woman. The world has fewer of them than it needs, and it misses each one. There was a silence after that. Not an awkward silence, rather the kind of silence that belongs to sorrow when it has been properly named. In the weeks that followed, the St. Mary Mead market resumed its shape, though never precisely its old one. Mrs. Melling's stall was absent. At first the absence was remarked upon every Saturday, then less often, then only by a glance. Village life is durable. It does not forget exactly, but it learns how to continue around what has happened. George Hollis remained at his fruit stall, loud again by degrees, though perhaps with a little more tenderness than before and a sharper eye for fairness. If a customer was short of a coin, he was more likely than ever to wave it away gruffly. Miss Violet Trent continued to attend with her notebook. Her records became, if anything, more exact. Stallholders sighed, but treated her observations with a degree of respect they had not always shown. Arthur Pike still came on Saturday mornings. He remained helpful but less easily directed. When asked to carry, place, deliver, fetch, or conceal anything, he asked what it was and why. This caused occasional amusement, but Miss Marple approved of it. The empty trestle near the centre of the market did not remain empty forever. By late June, a young woman had taken it over. She sold preserves, though not as many kinds as Clara had, and small cakes that were good but not yet distinguished. She arranged her stall neatly, though not with Clara Dunning's particular precision. Miss Marple bought a jar of strawberry preserve from her one Saturday and found it quite pleasant. The young woman placed the jar in a paper bag, tied the string twice, and set the change carefully upon the cloth. A habit beginning, perhaps. That was how such things started. A movement repeated. A choice made again. A way of folding paper, arranging jars, setting aside unsold goods. Over time, these small consistencies became the quiet record of a person's character. The market remembered such things, not in writing, not officially, not in a way Inspector Slack could place in a file, but in the minds of those who came week after week, who noticed without always knowing they noticed, who saw when a basket stood on the wrong side, when a voice was lowered, when a handkerchief lay where no handkerchief ought to lie. One bright morning near the end of June, Miss Marple walked home from the market with her basket on her arm. Behind her, the ordinary sounds of St. Mary Mead resumed. George Hollis calling out the merits of strawberries, Miss Trent questioning the price of plums, children negotiating for sweets, women discussing weather, flowers and funerals with equal seriousness. It sounded, to anyone passing, like nothing more than village life. Miss Marple knew better. Village life was never nothing more. It was a web of habits, affections, envies, kindnesses, deceits, loyalties, disappointments, small generosities, and smaller betrayals. It contained everything, if one looked long enough. She paused at the edge of the green and looked back once. The market went on, as it always had, as it always would. Then Miss Marple turned toward home, carrying her basket through the golden morning light, and behind her, in its quiet, unhurried way, St. Mary Mead remembered.